Hey everyone, it's Adam, and today I've got 5 intense family drama stories that will completely blow your mind. Imagine being treated like the invisible child while your sibling is treated like royalty. That's exactly what happened in our first story. My parents treated my sister like royalty, until I accidentally revealed the secret they'd been hiding for 20 years. Secrets, lies, and shocking revelations that turn everything you know about your family upside down. Then there's the story of being constantly overlooked, where everything you do seems to go unnoticed and your brother gets everything you ever wanted. I was the invisible child, while my brother got everything. Then I found out why my parents never loved me. It's a raw emotional journey that will make you feel every bit of that pain. Next, we have the ultimate betrayal that a simple DNA test revealed. My family always took my siblings' side, until a DNA test exposed the lie that destroyed our home. Imagine realizing your entire family was built on a lie. Heartbreaking, right? In another story, childhood competition takes a dark turn when old letters reveal a shocking truth. I grew up competing with my golden child brother. What I discovered in my mom's old letters changed everything. The past comes crashing into the present in ways you can't even imagine. And finally, the story of carrying the blame for every mistake in the family, only to finally expose the secret your parents forced you to carry alone. My parents blamed me for every problem, so I finally exposed the family secret they forced me to carry alone. The courage, the heartbreak, and the revenge. It's all here. So get ready, because each story is a roller coaster of emotions, secrets, and family betrayals, and you won't want to miss a single moment. My parents treated my sister like royalty until I accidentally revealed the secret they'd been hiding for 20 years. I'm 32 years old now, and it still feels strange admitting this out loud, but for most of my life, I felt like a guest in my own family, like someone who had wandered into the wrong house and decided it was easier to stay quiet than ask why he didn't belong. And when people asked me when I first noticed it, the favoritism, the imbalance, the way love seemed to flow in only one direction, I never have a big dramatic moment to point to, because it wasn't one thing, it was hundreds of small moments stacked on top of each other until they became a wall I couldn't see past. Moments so small that if I complained about them, I would have sounded petty, ungrateful, dramatic, and that's the worst part, because those small moments hurt more than anything loud ever could. My earliest memory of it goes back to when I was maybe 6 or 7, sitting at the kitchen table with my homework spread out, staring at a math problem I didn't understand while my mom stood a few feet away helping my sister Sarah practice for a school play. Her voice soft and encouraging, telling her how special she was, how proud she was, how she was going to be amazing on stage, and I remember clearing my throat a few times, shuffling my paper, finally saying "Mom," and not even getting a response, not a "wait a second," not a "hold on," just nothing, like I hadn't spoken at all. And eventually I figured it out myself, or pretended to, because asking again felt embarrassing, and that became a pattern before I even knew what patterns were. Sarah's 2 years younger than me, and from the moment she was born, it was like the house shifted around her, like furniture rearranging itself to make space. And I don't mean that in a bitter, cartoonish way. I mean it in the quiet, everyday sense. Her drawings went on the fridge, mine went into a drawer, her bad grades were blamed on pressure, mine were treated like personal failures. If she cried, it was because someone hurt her. If I cried, it was because I was too sensitive. And I learned very early that being low maintenance made life easier for everyone else. So I became exactly that. The kid who didn't ask for rides, didn't complain about food, didn't say when his shoes were too small, or when his chest hurt after running in PE, or when he felt lonely sitting alone at lunch. Because when you're the spare child, you learn that your needs are optional, and optional things are the first to get cut. Birthdays were the clearest example of this, not because mine were awful, but because they were forgettable, and I don't mean forgotten completely. My parents remembered the date, but they never felt important, like boxes that needed to be checked rather than days worth celebrating. I'd get a cake from the grocery store, usually whatever flavor was easiest, a gift that felt last minute, while Sarah's birthdays were events planned weeks in advance, themed decorations, her friends filling the living room, my parents hovering around with cameras and smiles. And I remember once, on my 10th birthday, sitting on the couch watching her help blow out my candles because she was excited, and everyone laughed, like it was cute, like it didn't matter that the moment wasn't really mine anymore. And when I think about it now, what hurts isn't that she blew out the candles, it's that no one noticed how I went quiet afterwards, how I didn't make a wish, how I just smiled and let it happen. Because that's what I always did. School events followed the same script. Sarah was creative, gifted, destined for something special, while I was responsible, independent, the easy one. Which sounds like a compliment until you realize it's just another way of saying you don't need attention. Parent-teacher conferences about her were full of concern and investment, discussions about how to help her thrive, while mine were short, efficient, and forgettable, because I was doing fine, and doing fine meant being invisible. And I learned that success didn't earn praise, it earned silence, which taught me a dangerous lesson, that if I wanted love, I had to need less of it. Sarah wasn't evil as a kid, and I want to be clear about that, because this story isn't about turning her into a villain. She was just raised in an environment where the world bent for her. where excuses were made before consequences ever had a chance to exist. And as we got older, that entitlement started to show. Not in dramatic ways, but in little comments, little digs that were always disguised as jokes, like calling me boring for staying home, or laughing when I mentioned being tired from working a part-time job in high school, saying, "Must be nice to have no life," while my parents chuckled along, and every time it happened, something in me folded inward. Because correcting her would have meant being labeled jealous or dramatic, and defending myself felt like more effort than it was worth. So I just absorbed it, and when you absorb enough of that kind of treatment, it starts to feel normal. One of the most painful realizations I've had as an adult is that I don't remember a single time either of my parents asked me how I was really doing. Not in a way that invited honesty, not in a way that made space for anything messy or uncomfortable. Their version of caring was making sure I didn't cause problems, and I was very good at that. I was the kid who packed his own lunch, who figured out public transportation early, who didn't need reminders to do homework, who didn't need checking in on, and they praised me for it without ever realizing that independence born from neglect isn't a strength, it's a survival skill. The loneliness was the hardest part. Not the lack of money or attention, but the feeling that if I disappeared, things would continue exactly the same. Family dinners would go on, conversations would flow, laughter would fill the room, and no one would notice the empty chair. Because I'd spent my entire childhood making myself small enough to fit into the background, and when you grow up like that, you stop believing you deserve to take up space. High school only reinforced it. Sarah became the center of everything. Sports, friends, drama, achievements, while I existed on the edges, driving myself to part-time jobs, saving what little money I could, planning for a future I knew I'd have to build alone. And the idea of asking my parents for help with college felt laughable. Not because they couldn't afford it, but because it never felt like something I was allowed to want. And when acceptance letters started coming in, there was no celebration, no pride, just practical questions about how I planned to pay for it, while Sarah's future was discussed like a shared family project, something everyone would contribute to. And that contrast didn't make me angry back then. It made me tired. Deeply, bone-weary tired, because fighting for recognition felt like screaming into a void. The night before I left for college is burned into my memory for how uneventful it was. My bags were packed, my paperwork was ready, and my parents were busy arguing with Sarah about something trivial. And I stood there in the doorway, waiting for someone to notice, to say something meaningful, to wish me luck or tell me they were proud. And eventually I realized it wasn't coming. So I hugged my mom myself, shook my dad's hand awkwardly, and left the house with the quiet understanding that this was how it had always been, and how it would probably always be. And as I drove away, I didn't cry, because I'd already done all my crying years earlier, alone in rooms no one ever came into. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, you'll understand this next part without me needing to explain it. There's a specific kind of grief that comes from realizing you were never the priority, not because you did something wrong, but because someone else was always chosen first. And that grief doesn't explode, it settles. It becomes part of you, shaping how you love, how you trust, how you ask for help. And by the time I reached adulthood, I wasn't angry anymore. I was resigned, convinced that being the spare child was just my role, something I had to accept, because challenging it would have meant confronting the possibility that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally never really saw me at all. And that was a truth I wasn't ready to face back then. Not yet. Adulthood didn't fix anything the way I secretly hoped it would. It didn't magically level the playing field, or make my parents suddenly see me as more than the quiet, reliable background character in their lives. If anything, it made the imbalance impossible to ignore. Because when you're a kid, favoritism hides behind authority and age and excuses like they don't know better. But when everyone is grown, when everyone has careers and bills and responsibilities, the truth has nowhere left to hide. And I saw it clearly every single time Sarah needed something, and it appeared effortlessly, while I learned to survive on my own without ever thinking to ask. After college, I moved to a small apartment, worked 2 jobs to keep up with student loan payments, learned how to budget down to the dollar, learned which bills could be paid late without immediate consequences, learned how to fix things myself because calling someone cost money I didn't have, and I didn't resent that struggle at first, because struggle felt familiar, it felt honest, it felt like proof that I was capable. But what started to gnaw at me was how different Sarah's path looked in comparison. How my parents helped her with rent just until she found her footing, how they paid off her credit card when she overspent, how they framed her mistakes as learning experiences while my successes were treated like expectations, not achievements. When Sarah quit jobs impulsively, it was because she was finding herself. When I stayed in jobs I hated, it was because I was stable. And that word, stable, followed me everywhere like a consolation prize, like something you say to someone when you don't have anything better to offer, and every family gathering became a reminder of where I stood, because conversations always drifted toward her plans, her stress, her needs, while I sat there listening, nodding, being the good son who didn't interrupt, didn't redirect the attention, didn't remind anyone that I existed beyond my seat at the table. Sarah's humor sharpened as we got older, not into cruelty that could be called out easily, but into that specific brand of joking that gives the speaker plausible deniability. Comments like, well, David wouldn't get it, he's always been kind of simple, said with a laugh, followed by, I'm kidding, relax if I reacted, or you're too sensitive if I looked uncomfortable, and my parents never stopped her, never corrected her tone, never asked her to apologize. They just smiled tightly or waved it off with, you know how she is. Like that phrase explained everything. Like it was a law of nature rather than a failure of accountability. And each time it happened, something twisted inside me. Because I wasn't angry enough to explode and not numb enough not to care, I was stuck in between, constantly negotiating with myself about whether this was worth addressing or whether staying silent was still the safer option. The worst part wasn't the jokes themselves. It was the way everyone seemed to agree with them by default. Not verbally, but through inaction, through the absence of defense, and silence, I've learned, can feel a lot like agreement when you're the one being diminished. I tried at different points to distance myself emotionally, to tell myself that their approval didn't matter, that I was building a life I could be proud of, and on paper, I was doing okay. I advanced at work, slowly but steadily. I paid down my loans, I moved to a better apartment. I dated unsuccessfully for the most part, because it turns out growing up invisible doesn't exactly prepare you to believe you're worthy of love. And every failed relationship reinforced a quiet voice in my head that said, maybe there really was something wrong with me. Maybe I was too boring, too guarded, too easy to overlook. And that voice sounded suspiciously like my own family. Holidays became the hardest because they forced proximity, forced conversation, forced comparisons, and every Thanksgiving or Christmas followed the same pattern. Sarah arriving late with a story about her stressful life, my parents fussing over her, asking if she'd eaten, if she was okay, if she needed anything, while I slipped in unnoticed, set my coat aside, and took on the role I perfected, listener, observer, emotional support when needed. And when my parents did ask about my life, it was surface level, polite, the kind of interest you show a coworker you don't know very well. And when I mentioned accomplishments like a promotion or a project I was proud of, the response was always muted, a quick, that's good, before the conversation drifted back to Sarah's problems. And I started to wonder if my success made them uncomfortable, because it didn't fit the narrative they built, the one where I was self-sufficient and therefore didn't need praise, where acknowledging my achievements might force them to confront how little they contributed to them. There were moments when resentment bubbled up so strongly it scared me. Moments when I'd be driving home after a family dinner with my jaw clenched so tight it hurt, replaying conversations in my head, imagining what it would have sounded like to finally speak up, to finally ask why I was treated differently. But those imagined confrontations always ended the same way, with me being labeled dramatic or ungrateful, with Sarah crying, with my parents defending her. And I knew that even if I spoke my truth, it wouldn't be received the way I needed it to be. So I swallowed it, again and again, until swallowing became second nature. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that parents are human, that favoritism isn't always intentional, that maybe they really didn't see the imbalance the way I did. And for a long time, that explanation was comforting because it meant no one was actively choosing to hurt me. It meant I wasn't unwanted, just overlooked. But that distinction started to crumble as the years passed, because overlooking someone for decades stops being accidental. It becomes a choice. And realizing that was like a slow internal collapse. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a steady erosion of the excuses I'd built to protect myself. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed blissfully unaware of the safety net beneath her. Or maybe she was aware and just never questioned it. And that ignorance fueled my frustration more than anything else. Because she never had to be careful, never had to plan for worst case scenarios, never had to wonder who would catch her if she fell, and watching her live with that certainty made my own cautiousness feel like a flaw rather than a consequence. And I started to internalize the idea that if I'd been more like her, louder, needier, messier, maybe I would have been loved differently. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I was exaggerating everything, if I was misremembering my childhood, if I was unfairly resentful. And that self-doubt was exhausting, because gaslighting doesn't always come from other people. Sometimes it grows inside you, nurtured by years of dismissal and minimization. And the most damaging belief I carried into adulthood was the idea that if I just tried harder, if I just achieved more, eventually I'd earn the recognition I'd been denied, that love was a transaction I hadn't quite paid for yet. Pretending not to care became my armor, sarcasm my shield, distance my defense. And people outside my family saw me as calm, dependable, emotionally steady, never realizing that those traits were built on a foundation of neglect, not confidence. And every time someone praised my resilience, it felt hollow, because resilience shouldn't have been necessary. I shouldn't have had to be strong in the absence of support. And by my early 30s, the gap between Sarah and me wasn't just emotional, it was philosophical. She moved through life assuming things would work out. I moved through life assuming they wouldn't unless I made them. And that difference colored every interaction we had. The anger readers probably feel for me at this point is something I didn't allow myself to feel fully back then, because anger felt dangerous. Like if I let it surface, it would consume me. So instead, I turned it inward, questioned my worth, minimized my pain, told myself stories about independence and self-reliance that sounded empowering but were really just coping mechanisms. And the hardest truth of that period is this: I wasn't just hurt by my family, I was shaped by them in ways that made it harder for me to accept love anywhere else. And I walked through adulthood carrying that weight quietly, convinced that maybe, just maybe, I was the problem all along, and that believing that was easier than confronting the possibility that the people who raised me had failed me in ways they were never willing to admit. The truth didn't come crashing into my life with shouting or tears or dramatic music playing in the background. It arrived quietly, almost politely, on an ordinary afternoon that didn't feel important enough to change everything, which I think is why it broke me the way it did. Because there was no emotional armor on, no warning bells, no instinct to brace myself, just a normal visit to my parents' house, the kind I'd done 100 times before, the kind where I already knew my role: to show up, be pleasant, not take up too much space, leave before anything could hurt. And it was so normal, so painfully normal, that even now, when I replay it in my head, I keep thinking there must have been some sign, some feeling in my gut telling me not to walk down that hallway, not to pause outside that room, but there wasn't. There was just me looking for a phone charger, hearing my mother's voice carry from the den, low and tired, the way it only ever sounded when she thought no one else was listening. And I stopped, not because I was trying to eavesdrop, but because I heard my name. And when you grow up being talked around instead of talked to, hearing your name spoken seriously has a way of freezing you in place. She was talking to my aunt, her sister, and at first it sounded like harmless reminiscing, something about old photos, about how fast time had passed, and I almost walked away, almost gave myself the gift of ignorance. But then my aunt said something I wasn't supposed to hear, something that landed like a crack in glass. She said, "Do you ever think about how different things might have been for David if that day hadn't happened?" And there was a long pause after that, long enough that my chest started to tighten, long enough that I should have left, but instead I stood there, my hand gripping the wall, my brain scrambling to understand what day she meant, because no one had ever talked about a day like that to me. And my mom finally answered, her voice breaking in a way I'd never heard before, saying, "Every day." And that single word shattered something inside me, because it wasn't confusion or denial or dismissal, it was certainty, heavy and absolute. And my aunt sighed and said, "You can't keep punishing him for it." And my mom whispered, "We weren't punishing him, we were protecting her." And I remember my stomach dropping at that sentence, because suddenly all the air felt like it had been sucked out of the house. And I wanted to burst into the room and demand explanations, but my legs wouldn't move, my body choosing stillness over confrontation the same way it always had. And my aunt's voice came back, sharper this time, saying, "Protecting her by neglecting him doesn't make it right." And my mom replied, "You didn't see the blood, you didn't hear him screaming, you didn't watch her standing there in shock. She was just a child." And that's when it hit me. Not all at once, but in fragments, like my mind was desperately trying to assemble a puzzle it never knew existed. Flashes of memory I'd always dismissed as nothing suddenly resurfacing. The scar near my hairline I never remembered getting. The vague hospital smell that used to make me anxious for no reason. The way my parents hovered over Sarah when she was young, like she was made of glass. The way my injuries were brushed off, minimized, joked about, and my aunt said softly, "David was a child too." And my mom's voice cracked completely as she said, "I know, and that's what kills me." And I don't remember much after that. Just the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. Just the feeling of something fundamental shifting. Because in that moment, the story of my life rearranged itself. And suddenly, nothing was random anymore. I didn't confront them that day. I didn't slam doors or demand answers or let my anger explode the way people expect in stories like this. I grabbed the charger, walked out the front door, got in my car, and sat there staring at the steering wheel until my hands stopped shaking, because I didn't know how to process what I just learned. Only that whatever that day was, it had defined my entire existence without my consent, and the drive home felt surreal, like I was watching my life through a fogged up window, my brain looping the same questions over and over. What happened? How bad was it? Why didn't anyone tell me? How long did they plan on keeping this from me? And when I finally got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat on the floor and tried to breathe, because the weight of it was crushing. Not just the secret itself, but the realization that my pain had been organized around it, justified by it, made acceptable because it served a purpose. Over the next few days, memories started resurfacing, whether I wanted them to or not. Like my mind had unlocked a door it had kept sealed for decades. I remembered being very young and falling down the stairs, or at least that's what I'd been told. I remembered waking up in a hospital bed with my head hurting and my parents crying. I remembered Sarah refusing to look at me for weeks afterwards, clinging to my mom whenever I came near, and I remembered being told I was fine, that kids bounce back, that I was lucky it wasn't worse. And I believed that story my whole life, never questioning why it didn't quite fit, never asking why my parents' guilt clung so tightly to Sarah while I was expected to move on, to be strong, to not dwell. And as the truth settled in, rage started to creep in alongside grief. Not explosive rage, but a cold, suffocating kind. Because what I realized was this: they had decided, silently and collectively, that my suffering was an acceptable price for her innocence, that protecting Sarah from guilt mattered more than protecting me from neglect, and that realization hurt in a way I don't think I have the language for, because it reframed every single moment of favoritism, not as love for her, but as damage control. And that made me feel less like a son and more like a collateral. The denial phase was brutal because part of me desperately wanted to believe I'd misunderstood, that I misheard, that context would somehow make it all okay. And I spent nights replaying the conversation in my head, analyzing every word, searching for an interpretation that didn't leave me feeling so disposable. But no matter how I twisted it, the conclusion remained the same. My parents had built their entire parenting dynamic around an event I was never allowed to know about. And in doing so, they had erased my right to be angry, to be hurt, to be anything other than accommodating. The most horrifying realization didn't come immediately. It crept in slowly, during mundane moments, like when I caught myself instinctively downplaying my needs at work or apologizing for taking up space in conversations, and I realized that the lesson I learned as a child, that my pain was inconvenient, had followed me into every corner of my adult life. And that lesson wasn't accidental. It was taught, reinforced, rewarded, because my quiet resilience made their guilt easier to live with. I started to see my parents differently. Not as villains, but as deeply flawed people who had made a choice and then doubled down on it for 20 years. And that nuance somehow made it worse, because it meant there was no grand evil to rage against, just a series of small, cowardly decisions that added up to a lifetime of emotional neglect. And I saw Sarah differently too, not as the entitled golden child I'd resented, but as a person whose entire identity had been shaped by fear and protection, by a secret she might not even fully understand. And that realization complicated my anger in ways I wasn't prepared for. Grief came next, heavy and disorienting. Grief for the childhood I could have had, for the version of myself that might have existed if I'd been allowed to need things. If I hadn't learned so early that love was conditional. Grief for the fact that my parents had known, had always known, and had still watched me struggle without stepping in. And through all of it, one thought kept looping in my mind, louder than the rest. My pain hadn't just been ignored, it had been convenient, because acknowledging it would have forced them to confront their own failure. And it was easier to let me believe I was strong than to admit they'd broken something in me. I didn't sleep much during that period, and when I did, my dreams were fragmented, filled with half-remembered images and feelings of falling, and I moved through my days on autopilot, functioning just enough to get by while my internal world collapsed, because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. And every memory gets re-examined under that harsh new light. And by the time the shock started to wear off, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing about my family, about myself, about my place in that house had been what I thought it was, and whatever came next, whatever confrontation or reckoning awaited, I was no longer the spare child who didn't ask questions. I was someone standing at the edge of a truth that had been hidden from him for 20 years, and the weight of that truth was heavier than anything I'd ever carried before. I didn't confront my parents right away, not because I was afraid of them, but because I was afraid of what would happen if I finally said everything out loud. Because once words exist, they can't be taken back. And for most of my life, silence had been my way of surviving. But there comes a point where silence stops being protective and starts being corrosive. And I reached that point quietly, one ordinary morning when I realized I was exhausted from carrying a truth that wasn't mine to hold alone. So I asked them to meet me at their house, the same house where I'd grown up feeling like a guest. And when I walked in, nothing looked different. The furniture was the same. The photos on the wall still told a version of our family that looked happy and balanced and whole, and that contrast almost broke me, because it reminded me how easy it is to hide pain behind familiarity. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd done homework alone while my sister was praised, and my parents smiled nervously, probably expecting a routine visit, maybe a polite check-in, and I remember thinking how unfair it felt that they still got to be comfortable, while my chest felt like it was collapsing in on itself. And when I finally spoke, my voice surprised even me with how calm it sounded, because I wasn't there to yell, I wasn't there to accuse, I was there to tell the truth, and I said, "I heard you talking the other day." And everything stopped, the air thickening instantly, my mom's face draining of color, my dad's hands tightening around his coffee mug. And in that moment, I knew I hadn't imagined it, that the secret was real, heavy and waiting, and I continued before they could interrupt, because I'd learned long ago that if I paused, I might lose my nerve. And I told them I knew there was an accident, that I knew something had happened when we were kids, that I knew it had shaped everything, and the silence that followed was deafening, not defensive, not angry, just devastated. And my mom started crying almost immediately, not loud sobs, but quiet, broken ones, like something inside her had finally given way. And my dad stared at the table like it might offer him an escape. And I remember thinking how strange it was that their guilt looked so small compared to the weight I'd been carrying. They didn't deny it, and in some ways that hurt more than denial would have, because it confirmed that I hadn't misunderstood, that my entire life had been organized around a truth I was never allowed to know. And my mom spoke first, telling me about the accident in halting fragments, about how Sarah had pushed me during a childish argument, how I'd fallen and hit my head, how there'd been blood and panic and a hospital visit I barely remembered, how the doctor said I'd be fine but that Sarah had been inconsolable, convinced she'd killed her brother, and as she spoke, I felt a strange detachment, like I was listening to a story about someone else, because the physical injury wasn't what mattered anymore. It was everything that came after, the choices they'd made in response, and when I asked them why they never told me, why they never explained, my dad finally looked up and said, "We thought it would protect her." And something in me hardened at that, because those words encapsulated everything I lived through. The idea that protection for one child justified neglect of the other, and I asked them, quietly, what about protecting me? And neither of them had an answer, just tears and apologies that came far too late to undo the damage. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult them. I just told them what it had been like growing up feeling invisible, how every moment of favoritism had cut a little deeper because I didn't understand why, how being the responsible one wasn't a compliment, it was a burden. How their silence had taught me that my pain was inconvenient, and as I spoke, I watched the realization dawn on them in real time. Watched them see the consequences of decisions they justified for decades, and it was heartbreaking in a way I hadn't anticipated, because they weren't monsters. They were people who had made a terrible choice and then built their lives around never questioning it. And seeing their guilt surface didn't bring me satisfaction. It brought me grief, because guilt doesn't heal wounds, it just acknowledges them. Sarah arrived halfway through the conversation, unaware of what she was walking into, and when she saw the state of our parents, her first instinct was to defend herself, to joke, to deflect, and when she realized the conversation was about her, about the accident, about the favoritism, something in her shifted, not into anger, but into confusion, like a piece of her identity had been pulled out from under her, and she looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something like fear mixed with shame, and she said, "I thought you didn't remember." And that sentence hurt more than anything else that day, because it confirmed that she'd known, at least partially, that the truth had been hidden, that the dynamic we grew up in wasn't accidental, and her reaction wasn't what I expected. She didn't lash out or deny it. She broke down, crying about how she'd lived her whole life believing she was fragile, dangerous, in need of constant protection, how our parents had hovered over her so intensely that she never learned to stand on her own. And listening to her, I felt my anger shift again. Not disappear, but transform into something heavier, more complicated. Because the truth was that the secret had damaged all of us, just in different ways. And acknowledging that didn't erase what I'd lost, but it reframed the story in a way that made blind rage impossible. I didn't forgive anyone that day, and I didn't promise anything about the future, because forgiveness isn't something you owe just because someone feels bad. And I told them that, calmly, honestly, that I wasn't there to absolve them. I was there to be seen, to finally take up the space I'd been denied, and that was the moment I felt something shift inside me, because for the first time, I wasn't asking for validation, I was asserting my reality, and that distinction mattered more than I realized at the time. The weeks that followed were quiet, awkward, filled with distance and tentative attempts at communication, my parents reaching out more than they ever had, asking questions they should have asked decades ago, and I engaged when I had the energy and pulled back when I didn't, because choosing myself no longer felt selfish, it felt necessary. And Sarah and I had conversations that were raw and uncomfortable, acknowledging resentment and guilt without trying to smooth it over, and while our relationship didn't magically heal, it became more honest than it had ever been, stripped of the roles we'd been forced into. The biggest change, though, wasn't in my family, it was in me, because once the truth was out, I stopped questioning my own memories, stopped minimizing my pain, stopped believing I'd imagined my way through a lifetime of neglect, and that validation, self-given and hard-earned, mattered more than anything my parents could offer, and I realized that peace doesn't come from being understood by the people who hurt you. It comes from understanding yourself well enough to stop carrying their failures as your own. The story doesn't end with reconciliation, wrapped in a bow, or a family suddenly transformed. It ends quieter than that, with me learning to set boundaries without guilt, learning to accept love without suspicion, learning that being the spare child was never a reflection of my worth, just a consequence of someone else's fear. And as I sit here now, writing this, I don't feel the need to scream or accuse or punish, because the truth has already done its work. It's reshaped my past and clarified my future, and that's enough. Because sometimes the most powerful ending isn't loud or triumphant. It's the moment you finally stop asking for permission to matter and realize you always did. The end. I was the invisible child, while my brother got everything. Then I found out why my parents never loved me. I don't know exactly when I realized I was invisible in my own house, because it wasn't one moment. It was more like growing up inside a fog where everyone else seemed solid and real, and I was just there, existing quietly, taking up space without ever being noticed. And my earliest memory that still stings when I think about it is standing in the hallway of our old suburban home in Ohio, clutching a crayon drawing I made at school, waiting for my parents to come out of the living room so I could show them, because my teacher had put a gold star on it and said I should be proud. and I remember waiting so long my arms started to hurt. Listening to them laugh with my older brother Mark about his little league game, how he'd hit the ball so far it almost cleared the fence, how proud they were, how he was going places. And when I finally walked in and held up my drawing, my mom glanced at it for maybe half a second and said, "That's nice, honey," without really looking, and my dad didn't look at all. And Mark rolled his eyes like I was interrupting something important, and I remember standing there, feeling stupid for thinking it mattered, folding the paper and shoving it into my pocket, and that feeling of shrinking, of learning to make myself smaller so I wouldn't be in the way, became the background noise of my entire childhood. Mark was 2 years older than me, which in kid years might as well be a decade, and from the outside we probably looked like a normal American family: 2 parents, 2 kids, a decent house in a safe neighborhood, dinners at the table most nights. But inside there was an invisible line that separated him from me, and he always stood on the side that was warm and bright while I stood in the shade, watching, learning early that attention was something you earned, and somehow I never seemed to earn enough, because Mark's achievements were announced like breaking news. Honor roll certificates taped to the fridge, trophies polished and displayed, his photos framed and hung in the hallway, while mine were treated like background static, things that existed but didn't require acknowledgement. And it wasn't that my parents were screaming or abusive or drunk or cruel in obvious ways, which almost made it worse because there was nothing concrete I could point to and say, "See, this is why it hurts." They fed me, clothed me, drove me to school, paid the bills, asked if I'd done my homework, but warmth, curiosity, interest in who I was as a person, that part was missing. Like a room in a house that was never finished. And as a kid, you don't think in those terms, you just think in feelings. And the feeling I lived with was that I was tolerated, not cherished. Birthdays were one of the first places I noticed it clearly, because Mark's birthdays were events. Balloons, friends over, cakes with themes he liked, my parents hovering around him taking photos, laughing, singing loudly, while mine were often afterthoughts, sometimes combined with his if they were too close together, even though they were months apart, sometimes remembered late in the day with a grocery store cake and a rushed, "Sorry, we've been busy." And I learned to say, "It's okay," before anyone else asked if it was, because disappointment seemed to annoy them more than forgetting did. And clothes were another quiet lesson, because Mark always got new stuff when school started, brand name sneakers, jerseys of his favorite teams, while I got his old things once he'd outgrown them, shirts stretched at the collar, jeans worn thin at the knees. And when I once asked why he always got new clothes and I didn't, my mom sighed like I was being difficult and said, "Stop being dramatic. There's nothing wrong with hand-me-downs." And there wasn't, logically, but emotionally it felt like another confirmation that I was second place by default. School events were worse because that's where other kids' parents showed up, clapping in bleachers, waving from folding chairs, and I learned to scan crowds automatically, hoping to spot my mom's coat or my dad's baseball cap. And most of the time I didn't see them, and when I asked afterward why they hadn't come, the answers were always practical. Work ran late, traffic was bad, Mark had practice, but the pattern was clear even if no one ever said it out loud, because they never missed Mark's games. Not once, rain or shine, and I started telling teachers they didn't need to come, that it was fine, that I didn't mind because it was easier than explaining the hollow feeling of performing for an empty seat. Conflicts between me and Mark followed the same script every time, predictable enough that I could recite it before it happened, because if something broke, if voices were raised, if someone got hurt, the assumption was always that it was my fault. And even when Mark was clearly the instigator, the response was usually, "What did you do to make him react like that?" And I learned to apologize quickly, even when I didn't understand what I was apologizing for, because pushing back only made things worse. And the phrase, "Stop being dramatic," became a kind of family motto whenever I tried to express that something hurt me, as if feelings were an inconvenience, something messy that needed to be shut down. And over time, I internalized that message so deeply that I stopped trying to explain myself at all. I don't remember my parents ever asking me what I liked, what I wanted to be, what scared me, and if they did, it didn't stick because the sense that I was fundamentally uninteresting to them settled into my bones. And kids are brutally logical in that way, because when you're small and the people who created you don't seem to care, you don't think they're flawed, you think, "I must be." And I carried that belief with me like a second spine, shaping the way I moved through the world, making me quiet in classrooms, hesitant with friends, always waiting for permission to exist. Holidays were strange too, because from the outside they looked warm and normal, but inside I felt like a guest in my own family, smiling politely, helping clear dishes, listening to stories that mostly revolved around Mark's accomplishments. And even when relatives asked about me, my parents would answer for me, brief and factual, like they were reciting information from a form, and I would nod along, feeling oddly detached from my own life. As I got older, I tried different strategies to fix whatever was wrong with me, because surely there had to be a way to earn what came so easily to my brother. So I tried being the good kid, the responsible one, the one who didn't get into trouble, who did his homework, who stayed quiet, and when that didn't work, I tried excelling academically, bringing home good grades, hoping maybe a report card full of A's would finally make them look at me with pride. And they'd say things like, good job, without looking up from their phones, while Mark's average grades were celebrated with dinners out and bragging to friends. And I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need their approval, but that was a lie. I repeated because the truth hurt too much. The house itself felt different depending on where you stood, because the living room was Mark's territory, where my parents gathered, laughed, watched his games on TV, while my bedroom became my refuge, the place where I could exist without feeling like I was in the way. And I spent hours there reading, listening to music, imagining futures where I mattered to someone, somewhere, and sometimes I'd hear my parents and Mark laughing downstairs and feel this sharp, aching loneliness even though we were all under the same roof. Adolescence only amplified everything, because that's when you're supposed to be figuring out who you are. And I had no reflection to look into, no one mirroring me back to myself. And when I struggled, when I felt sad or angry or confused, the response was always minimization, practical advice without empathy, like feelings were a malfunction rather than a signal. And I learned to shut down parts of myself just to keep the peace. There were moments, small, fleeting ones, where I thought things might change, like when my dad once helped me with a science project late at night, and for an hour it felt like maybe I wasn't invisible after all. But those moments never lasted, never turned into patterns, and hope became something dangerous I tried not to indulge. By the time high school rolled around, I had accepted my role so completely that teachers described me as self-sufficient and mature, not realizing that what they were really seeing was a kid who had learned not to ask for help because asking usually led nowhere. And when college brochures started arriving in the mail, something inside me sparked for the first time, because college represented distance, escape, a chance to reinvent myself somewhere my family's indifference couldn't reach. And when I told my parents where I'd applied, they nodded, offered logistical advice, asked about costs, but there was no emotion there. No, we'll miss you. No, we're proud of you. And when I finally got my acceptance letter and realized I was leaving, the dominant feeling wasn't excitement or fear, it was numbness, like I had already learned not to expect anything more. And on the day I packed my car, my mom hugged me briefly, my dad clapped me on the shoulder, Mark barely looked up from his phone, and as I drove away from the only home I'd ever known, I told myself that distance would heal whatever was broken inside me. That once I was gone, once I stopped hoping for something that was never coming, I'd finally feel free. But even then, somewhere deep down, there was this quiet, aching thought that followed me onto the highway, whispering the belief I'd carried my whole life. If my own parents never really saw me, then maybe I wasn't meant to be seen at all. When I left for college, I genuinely believed I was starting over. That distance would turn me into someone new, someone lighter, someone who didn't constantly feel like they were auditioning for love. And for a while, I told myself it was working, because no one there knew my role as the invisible kid. No one compared me to Mark. No one had already decided what I was worth before I even opened my mouth. And that freedom felt intoxicating. But instead of using it to relax, I did what I'd been trained to do my entire life. I tried to earn my place by being exceptional, because somewhere deep inside me was a stubborn, aching belief that if I could just become impressive enough, accomplished enough, useful enough, my parents would finally look at me the way they looked at my brother. So I threw myself into my class with a kind of desperate intensity, sat in the front row, volunteered answers, stayed late to ask professors questions, not because I loved the material, but because I needed the validation of being seen as competent, as valuable. And when grades came back and they were good, really good, I felt a brief, sharp rush of pride, followed immediately by emptiness, because I still checked my phone, hoping for a message from home that never came. Still imagined my parents bragging about me to someone, anyone, the way they did with Mark. And when I called to tell them I'd made the dean's list, my mom said, "That's nice," in the same tone she'd used on my crayon drawing years ago, and my dad asked if I'd thought about how much tuition cost. And the moment passed like it always did, unnoticed and uncelebrated, and instead of questioning why that hurt so much, I doubled down, because effort had always felt safer than honesty. Money was tight from the start, and unlike Mark, who had my parents covering parts of his expenses and stepping in whenever something went wrong, I was told early on that college was my responsibility, that I needed to learn independence, so I worked. First part-time, then 2 jobs, then sometimes 3, balancing shifts at a campus library, a coffee shop, and later a warehouse on the outskirts of town. Coming back to my dorm exhausted, hands aching, mind buzzing, telling myself this was what being an adult looked like, that this struggle was character building, and every time I felt overwhelmed, I reminded myself that asking for help had never really worked out for me anyway. So I learned how to do everything alone, how to budget down to the last dollar, how to survive on cheap food, how to keep my head down and push through, and on paper I was thriving. The kind of student people pointed to as an example of grit. But emotionally, I felt hollow, like I was running on fumes and applause from strangers couldn't fill the space where parental love was supposed to be. Mark's life, meanwhile, continued on a parallel track that felt almost unreal in comparison. because while I was working myself into the ground, he was calling home whenever something went wrong and having it fixed for him. My parents helping with rent when he overspent, sending money when his car broke down, offering emotional reassurance when he messed up. And I heard about these things secondhand, usually casually mentioned in conversation as if they were no big deal. And every time I heard them, I felt this mix of jealousy and shame because part of me resented him for having what I never did. And another part of me felt guilty for even feeling that way, telling myself I should be happy for him, that this wasn't a competition, even though it had always felt like one I was losing without knowing the rules. Holidays during those years were especially strange because coming home felt less like returning to a safe place and more like stepping into a role I no longer fit, sitting at the table while conversations flowed around me, mostly about Mark's life, his plans, his struggles, his successes, and when I spoke, it was usually to answer direct questions, factual updates delivered efficiently because it was clear they didn't really want the details. And I started noticing something that hurt more than outright neglect. They didn't actually know me, didn't know what I was studying beyond a vague idea, didn't know my friends' names, didn't know what I cared about or worried about or dreamed of, and the realization settled in slowly, painfully, that I was essentially a stranger to the people who had raised me. Still, I kept hoping, because hope is stubborn like that, and I told myself that maybe once I graduated, once I got a good job, once I proved that all their investment, or lack of it, had paid off, things would change, so I avoided trouble like my life depended on it, didn't party much, didn't take risks, didn't let myself fall apart even when I wanted to, because I'd learned that being low maintenance was the closest thing I got to approval. And friends sometimes joked that I seemed older than my age, more put together, not realizing that what they were seeing wasn't maturity but armor. Layers and layers of self-reliance built to protect a kid who had learned early that no one was coming to save him. After graduation, I landed a decent job, nothing glamorous but stable, and for a moment I allowed myself to imagine that this would be the turning point, that I finally crossed whatever invisible threshold had kept me on the outside. And when I told my parents about the offer, my dad nodded and said, "Good, that's what you're supposed to do." And my mom asked about benefits, and that was it. No pride, no celebration, just expectation. Like, success was my baseline and anything less would have been a disappointment, and I felt stupid for expecting anything else, but that didn't stop the ache. Family gatherings grew more uncomfortable as time went on because I could feel the distance widening instead of closing, conversations feeling transactional, polite, surface level, like we were coworkers forced into the same break room rather than a family that shared history and affection. And I started to realize that I didn't miss them the way people are supposed to miss their families. I missed the idea of what they could have been, the parents I kept hoping they'd turn into if I just waited long enough or did enough to deserve it. The belief that haunted me most during those years was simple and cruel. If I become enough, they'll finally love me. And it shaped so many of my choices, pushing me to overwork, to overachieve, to swallow my feelings and present a version of myself that was palatable and impressive. And sometimes I caught myself fantasizing about a future moment where they'd finally see me, finally apologize, finally explain, and I hated myself for still wanting that, for not being able to let go of something I'd never really had. The turning point came quietly at first, the way life-changing moments often do, with a phone call that felt different the moment I answered it. My mom's voice tight, controlled in that way people get when they're trying not to panic, telling me there was a situation at home, that my dad was sick, or there was a financial issue, or something serious enough that they needed me to come back. And as I packed a bag and drove toward the house I'd left behind, I felt a strange mix of dread and hope, because part of me wondered if this was finally it, if crisis would force honesty, if something unspoken would finally surface. And as the familiar streets came into view and I pulled into the driveway, I had no idea that this moment, this return, was about to crack open a silence my family had been carefully maintaining for decades, setting the stage for truths I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. And as I stepped back into that house, the same one where I'd learned to make myself small, I felt the weight of all the years I'd spent trying to earn love pressed down on me. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if the problem had never been me at all. When I walked back into that house after years away, the walls felt closer than I remembered, like they'd been inching inward the whole time I was gone, and everything smelled the same. Old furniture, cleaning spray, something faintly metallic, and it was unsettling how quickly my body slipped back into old habits, shoulders tense, voice careful, heart braced for dismissal, because whatever had happened, whatever emergency had dragged me back, this was still the place where I'd learned how to disappear. And at first nothing dramatic happened, just quiet, heavy conversations in low voices, my dad resting more than usual, my mom moving around the kitchen with a nervous energy that felt rehearsed, Mark hovering like a satellite, concerned but still somehow centered in their attention. And I tried to be useful, tried to help, because That had always been my role. The one way I knew how to justify my presence, but the air felt thick with something unspoken. Like a storm gathering that everyone could feel, but no one wanted to name. And it came out in fragments at first. Little slips in conversation, glances exchanged too quickly, my mom flinching when I asked innocent questions, my dad growing quiet whenever the past came up, and one night, when I couldn't sleep and went downstairs for water, I heard my parents talking in the living room. Voices low but strained, and normally I would have backed away, pretended I hadn't heard anything, because eavesdropping felt like crossing a line I was never invited over. But something in their tone stopped me. My mom's voice shaking in a way I'd never heard before. My dad responding in clipped, controlled sentences, and I stood there in the hallway, heart pounding, listening to my name come up in a way that made my stomach drop. Not casually, not dismissively, but like a problem being discussed, and I heard my mom say, "We did the best we could." And my dad reply, "That doesn't mean it didn't affect him." And then the words that changed everything. He was never part of the plan. And my brain snagged on that phrase like it had teeth because it didn't make sense, not in the context of parents talking about their child. And before I could stop myself, I stepped into the doorway, my voice coming out shaky but loud enough to cut through the conversation, asking, "What did you just say?" And the silence that followed was deafening, the kind that presses on your ears until you feel dizzy. My mom's face draining of color, my dad closing his eyes like he'd been waiting for this moment and dreading it in equal measure, and no one spoke for a long second. Then another, until finally my mom said my name in that warning tone I'd heard my whole life, the one that meant stop, don't ask, don't push. But something in me snapped, maybe because I was older now, maybe because I was tired of carrying questions alone, and I said it again, slower, steadier. "What did you mean by that?" And that's when everything they'd spent decades avoiding started to spill out. Not cleanly, not all at once, but in broken pieces that cut deeper because of how long they'd been buried. My dad sitting down heavily, my mom pacing like she was looking for an exit, and the truth emerging in fragments. That before me, there had been plans, expectations, a version of their life that didn't include a second child. That my brother was the timing they wanted, the stability they aimed for, and I was what happened when things went off script, when a mistake or an accident or a moment of weakness, or whatever word they wanted to soften it with, changed everything. And as they talked, I felt like I was watching my entire childhood rearrange itself in my head, memories snapping into place in a way that was both horrifying and clarifying. My mom admitting through tears that when she found out she was pregnant with me, it wasn't joy she felt, but panic, fear about money, about her career, about what people would think, about how their lives were supposed to look, and my dad admitting that instead of dealing with those feelings, they'd bury them, push forward, told themselves they'd adjust, that love would come later, and when it didn't, when resentment lingered, when guilt curdled into distance, they never addressed it, just lived around it. And the house suddenly felt too small to contain the weight of that confession, because this wasn't about one bad year or a rough patch. This was about a fundamental truth that had shaped every interaction I'd ever had with them, and I asked the question that had been screaming in my head since I was old enough to notice the difference between me and Mark, my voice barely holding together as I said, "So you just never wanted me?" And my mom broke down completely at that, sobbing in a way that was raw and unfiltered, saying it wasn't that simple, that she loved me in her own way, that she tried, that she felt ashamed for even feeling the way she did. And my dad said something about responsibility, about doing what you're supposed to do, and none of it made it better, because what I was hearing, beneath all the justifications and explanations, was that I had grown up as a living reminder of something they regretted, something they'd never processed, and suddenly the coldness, the distance, the favoritism all made a terrible kind of sense. Not because it was okay, but because it was consistent, because my brother represented the life they wanted, and I represented the life that happened anyway. And that realization hit harder than any outright cruelty ever could, because it meant that all those years I'd spent trying to be enough, trying to earn love, trying to fix myself, had been built on a lie, and I felt something inside me collapse, like a structure I'd been propping up my whole life finally giving way. And for a few moments I couldn't even feel angry, just stunned, hollowed out by the sheer scale of it, by the understanding that the problem had never been my grades or my behavior or my personality. It had been my existence. And I remember laughing then, a short broken sound that startled everyone in the room, because it was either laugh or scream. And I said something like, "So all this time it wasn't that I wasn't good enough, it's that I was never supposed to be here." And my dad tried to interrupt, tried to soften it, but the words were already out there, heavy and irreversible. And in that moment, something strange happened, because alongside the grief and the anger and the hurt, there was also relief, a quiet, unexpected release, because for the first time in my life, the story made sense. The puzzle pieces clicked together in a way that didn't require me to be fundamentally flawed, and that realization didn't erase the pain, but it shifted it, moved it out of my core and into a place where I could actually look at it, examine it, understand it. And as the conversation dragged on, filled with apologies that came too late and explanations that felt inadequate, I realized I wasn't waiting for them to fix anything anymore, because nothing they said could give me back the childhood I lost or the sense of belonging I'd never had. But what it could give me, what it was giving me, even as it hurt, was clarity. And clarity is a powerful thing because it strips away illusions and leaves you with choices. And as I sat there, listening to my parents grapple with the truth they'd avoided for decades, I felt my identity shift, not shatter completely, but reconfigure, because I was no longer the invisible kid trying to earn a place at the table. I was an adult who finally understood why the table had always felt close to him. And when I went to bed that night, lying awake in the room where I'd spent so many years feeling unseen, the house quiet around me, I didn't feel whole or healed or at peace, but I felt something new taking root beneath the wreckage. A fragile, unfamiliar sense that maybe I wasn't broken after all, that maybe the story I'd told myself for so long was wrong, and that realization, painful as it was, marked the beginning of something different, something that would force me to decide who I was without the weight of their silence pressing down on me anymore. After that night, after the truth finally broke through the walls of that house, nothing exploded the way movies make you think it should. There were no dramatic exits or screaming matches or sudden transformations, just a strange, heavy quiet that settled over everything, like dust after a collapse. And for a few days I stayed because it felt expected, because leaving immediately would have looked like punishment. And I wasn't trying to punish anyone anymore. I was too tired for that. So I moved through the house, slowly, deliberately, noticing things I'd never really let myself notice before. The way my parents avoided my eyes now, not out of indifference but discomfort. The way my mom kept hovering like she wanted to say something meaningful but didn't know how. The way my dad retreated into silence because that had always been his safest language, and Mark tried, awkwardly, to bridge a gap he hadn't even known existed, making small talk, offering help, looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time and realizing how little he actually knew. And it would have been easy to lean into anger then, to let resentment finally have its moment. But something in me had shifted, because once the truth was out, anger felt almost pointless, like shouting at a locked door after you'd already found out there was never a room behind it meant for you. And instead, what I felt was grief, deep and unrelenting, grief for the version of myself that kept trying, for the kid who learned to be quiet and useful instead of loud and loved, for the years I spent believing neglect was a measurement of my worth, and I let myself feel that grief fully for the first time, alone in my old bedroom, sitting on the bed where I used to lie awake, listening to laughter downstairs, finally understanding that none of it had been imaginary. None of it had been me exaggerating or being dramatic. It had been real. And acknowledging that was painful, but also grounding, because you can't heal something you keep pretending doesn't exist. Conversations with my parents after that were awkward and uneven, filled with pauses and half sentences, my mom apologizing in ways that circled the truth without ever landing fully on it. My dad offering explanations that sounded more like justifications, and I realized quickly that answers don't automatically come with accountability, that understanding why something happened doesn't magically undo its impact, and expecting them to suddenly become emotionally fluent, self-aware people after decades of avoidance was just another version of the same old hope that had kept me stuck. So I stopped asking for more than they were capable of giving, not out of bitterness, but out of realism, because holding people to expectations they've shown you again and again they can't meet only hurts you in the end. The biggest shift happened quietly, internally, when I stopped framing my life around their reactions altogether, stopped wondering what they thought of my choices, stopped replaying conversations in my head, trying to figure out how I could have said something differently to make them understand me better. Because the truth was, they understood enough. They always had. They just hadn't known how or been willing to face what that understanding required of them. And once I accepted that, something loosened inside me, a tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying, and I started thinking about family in a way that had nothing to do with blood or obligation, thinking about the friends who showed up without being asked, the coworkers who noticed when I was off, the people who listened without waiting for their turn to speak, the ones who saw me, not because I'd earned it, but because that's what connection looks like when it's healthy. And it dawned on me that I'd already been building a family of my own without giving it that name, because I'd been so focused on the one I thought I was supposed to fix. Leaving that house the second time felt different from the first because I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't chasing distance as a cure. I was choosing space as a boundary, and when I hugged my mom goodbye, it was gentle but firm. A hug that acknowledged history without promising resolution. And when I shook my dad's hand, it wasn't cold, just honest. And when I looked at Mark, I felt something close to neutrality for the first time. Not resentment, not longing, just acceptance of the fact that we'd been raised in the same house but lived entirely different emotional lives, and that wasn't something either of us could change retroactively. Back in my own apartment, in my own life, I started doing small, intentional things that felt radical in their simplicity, like resting without guilt, saying no without explaining, expressing needs without apologizing, and each of those moments chipped away at the belief that my value was conditional, that I had to be low maintenance, impressive, or useful to deserve space, and I grieved the childhood I never had properly. Not in a dramatic way, but in quiet moments that caught me off guard, like seeing a father teach his kid to ride a bike or hearing a parent brag about their child's weird, wonderful quirks. Moments that reminded me of what I'd missed and what I couldn't get back. And instead of hardening myself against that pain, I let it pass through me, trusting that feeling it fully was part of letting it go. My parents didn't suddenly become different people. There was no grand reconciliation or satisfying confession that wrapped everything up neatly, just occasional check-ins, some genuine regret, some defensiveness, and long stretches of silence. And surprisingly, that stopped bothering me as much because I wasn't measuring my healing by their growth anymore. I was measuring it by my own, by how often I caught myself speaking kindly to myself instead of critically, by how rarely I heard their voices in my head when making decisions, by how natural it began to feel to take up space without shrinking. And the further I moved into that mindset, the clearer everything became. The patterns, the wounds, the ways neglect had shaped me, and also the ways it hadn't destroyed me. Because resilience doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like survival, like choosing not to repeat what hurt you, like building something softer and stronger out of the rubble. One night, months later, sitting alone in my apartment with the city humming quietly outside, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not because what happened was okay, but because anger had done its job. It had protected me long enough for me to understand the truth, and now it was time to set it down. And in that stillness, I finally put words to a realization that had been forming since that night in my parents' living room. A sentence so simple it felt devastating in its clarity, because it explained everything without blaming me at all. I spent my whole life trying to be seen by people who never learned how to look, and saying that didn't make me feel small or broken anymore. It made me feel awake, because once you understand that, truly understand it, you stop contorting yourself for visibility. You stop mistaking neglect for reflection, and you start turning your attention toward the people, and the parts of yourself that have been there all along, waiting patiently to be acknowledged. And that's how my story ends. Not with forgiveness or revenge or perfect closure, but with something quieter and harder earned. The understanding that being invisible to them never meant I was invisible at all. The end. My family always took my sibling's side, until a DNA test exposed the lie that destroyed our home. I don't know when I first realized I didn't belong in my own family, only that the feeling has always been there. Like background noise, you stop noticing until it's suddenly too loud to ignore. And growing up in our suburban American house, with its white fence, framed family photos, and neighbors who thought we were so lucky, I learned early that love in my home came with conditions I never seemed able to meet. Because from the moment my younger sibling was born, everything shifted in ways no one ever acknowledged out loud, but everyone enforced through actions, tones, and silence. And if you'd asked my parents, they would have sworn they treated us the same, that they were fair, that I was imagining things, that I was just too sensitive, which became their favorite phrase for me. The way some families pass down heirlooms, except this one lodged itself into my chest and stayed there, shaping how I saw myself for years. My sibling, smart, charming, effortlessly liked, could do no wrong. And I don't say that as bitterness speaking now, but as a simple fact I observed as a child with the careful attention of someone trying to survive emotionally. Because if my sibling forgot homework, it was because the teacher didn't explain well. If they talked back, it was because they were stressed. If they lied, it was because they were scared. But if I made the same mistakes, they became proof of some deeper flaw in my character. Evidence that something about me was off. Ungrateful, dramatic, difficult. And I remember being maybe 7 or 8 and standing in the kitchen while my sibling cried about something trivial, something I'd supposedly done, and watching my mother kneel in front of them, wiping their tears, shooting me a look over her shoulder that said I'd already lost. And my father didn't even ask what happened. He just sighed like I was exhausting him again and said, "Why do you always have to start something?" And I didn't even know what I'd started, but I apologized anyway because that's what kept the peace. And that became my role. The apologizer, the one who smoothed things over, the one who learned quickly that defending myself only made it worse. Because defending myself meant attitude, meant disrespect, meant proving them right about me. So I swallowed words before they reached my mouth and learned how to make myself smaller in rooms where my sibling expanded freely. And holidays were the worst because relatives came over and the favoritism became a quiet performance everyone pretended not to see. With my aunt praising my siblings' achievements while asking me if I was still figuring things out, uncles joking about how I was the sensitive one, family friends telling my parents how lucky they were to have such a talented younger child while patting my head like I was a side note. And if I ever tried to point out the difference in treatment later, even gently, my parents reacted like I'd accused them of something unforgivable. My mom would get hurt and defensive, my dad would get cold and say I was being unfair, that I was always looking for problems, that I needed to stop comparing myself, and comparison became another word they use like a weapon. Because how could I not compare when the differences were so obvious, when punishments were harsher for me, when expectations were higher, when forgiveness was rarer? And I remember once in middle school, my sibling broke a lamp while roughhousing inside the house, blamed it on me without hesitation, and before I could even speak, my father grounded me for a month, took my phone, canceled a birthday sleepover I'd been looking forward to for weeks. And when I tried to explain through tears that it wasn't me, my mother snapped, "See, this is what I mean, always the victim." And something in me cracked quietly then, because I realized they didn't just believe my sibling more, they trusted them more. They saw goodness in them and assumed the worst in me by default. And living like that teaches you dangerous lessons, like how to doubt your own memory, how to second guess your feelings, how to accept blame even when you're innocent, how to think love is something you earn by being less of yourself. And by the time I reached high school, I had internalized their narrative so deeply that I didn't even argue anymore. I just accepted that I was the problem, the difficult one, the one who made things harder, and teachers noticed it too. How I apologized for asking questions, how I shrank during group work, how I overachieved quietly without expecting praise because praise felt foreign and suspicious. And my sibling thrived, surrounded by friends, supported loudly by our parents at every event, while I sat in the audience clapping politely, invisible even when I did well. And when I got into a decent college, my parents congratulated me with polite smiles but spent weeks celebrating my sibling's smaller achievement like it was a national holiday. And I told myself I was being dramatic for feeling hurt, because that's what I'd been trained to do. Minimize my pain before anyone else could. And adulthood didn't magically fix things either, because patterns like that don't disappear just because you age out of childhood. They follow you, they whisper in your ear during job interviews and relationships and friendships, telling you not to ask for too much, not to expect fairness, not to assume people will choose you when there's someone easier around. And the older I got, the more distance I put between myself and my family. Not dramatically, not with a big fight, but quietly. The way you drift from a place that never really felt like home. And by my mid-20s, I was financially independent, living on my own, building a life that didn't require their approval, keeping contact polite but limited, calling on holidays, showing up when necessary, leaving early when conversations turned into subtle jabs or comparisons. And part of me felt guilty for pulling away because I'd been raised to believe my needs were inconveniences, but another part of me finally felt like I could breathe. Like I didn't have to perform a version of myself designed to be tolerated rather than loved. And still, even with all that distance, some small hopeful part of me believed that maybe one day they'd see it. That maybe with time and space they'd understand how much their favoritism hurt me. That maybe it wasn't intentional. That maybe I really was just too sensitive, because believing that hurt less than believing they chose not to love me the same way. And that's the mindset I was in when my body forced me to confront something I never expected, because a routine doctor's visit turned into a longer conversation, when some test results came back slightly off, nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough to raise questions about genetic risks and family medical history. And my doctor asked me about conditions that ran in my family, and I froze in that exam room, realizing I didn't actually know, because anytime I'd asked growing up, it was brushed off or vaguely answered. And when I told her that, she suggested something casually, something that felt small at the time but would later split my life cleanly into two. She said, "It might be helpful to do a DNA test just to get a clearer picture." And I nodded, thinking it was just another box to check, another practical step, never imagining that this simple suggestion, made in a quiet room with medical posters on the walls, was about to explain a lifetime of feeling like the child who never truly belonged. I went into the DNA test the way you go into paperwork or blood work, with no emotion attached, just a sense of adult responsibility. Because in my head, it was never about identity or family or anything dramatic. It was about numbers and risks and probabilities, about giving my doctor clearer answers so I could take better care of my body. And when I ordered the kit, I didn't even tell my parents at first because it didn't feel important enough to mention. But somehow, they found out anyway. My mother called me one evening, her voice too casual, asking why I'd been asking questions about family health history. And when I told her my doctor suggested a DNA test, she went quiet in a way that felt heavy rather than thoughtful, then laughed a little too quickly and said I didn't need to go digging into the past, that whatever I needed to know was already known, that those tests were unreliable anyway. And I remember standing in my apartment kitchen, holding my phone and feeling that familiar internal flicker of doubt, wondering if I was overreacting again, but something about the way she said it, almost pleading without sounding like it, made my stomach tighten. And my father was no better when I mentioned it to him later, brushing it off with a sharp, "Those things cause more problems than they solve," which struck me as a strange thing to say about a medical tool. And as the weeks passed, while I waited for the results, I noticed little things that felt off only because I'd lived my entire life trained to notice emotional shifts, like how my mom suddenly called more often but avoided personal topics, how my dad steered conversations toward my sibling whenever I brought up anything about myself, how both of them seemed tense in a way that didn't match the situation, and I tried to convince myself I was projecting meaning where there was none, because surely no one would be that nervous about a DNA test unless they had something to hide, and that thought felt too dramatic, too much like the stories you read online and swear could never be you. So I shoved it down and focused on work and routines until the email came in one ordinary afternoon. Subject line bland, notification unremarkable, and I almost ignored it until later because I was in the middle of something, but curiosity won out, and I opened it without ceremony, expecting charts and percentages, and at first that's exactly what I saw: ancestry breakdowns, markers, medical notes, until my eyes landed on a line that made my brain stall. Something about parental matches, and I reread it twice because it didn't make sense, and then a third time more slowly, my heart starting to pound as the words refused to rearrange themselves into something comforting. Because according to the results, there was no genetic match to my father. Not partial, not low probability, but none. And I felt dizzy in that quiet way where the world doesn't spin, but your body forgets how to be steady. And my immediate reaction wasn't panic or betrayal, but denial. Pure and simple, because this kind of thing doesn't happen accidentally. It's either a mistake or a misunderstanding. So I told myself the test was wrong, that samples get mixed up, that technology isn't perfect, that the universe isn't that cruel, and I scrolled further, hoping to find clarification, only to see notes about irregularities on my mother's side too. Partial matches that didn't line up the way they should, and I closed my laptop like I could trap the information inside it, then opened it again 10 minutes later because reality doesn't disappear just because you don't look at it. And after a sleepless night spent Googling phrases like DNA test, false negative parent, and lab error, no paternal match, I did the most logical thing I could think of. I ordered another test from a completely different company, telling no one this time, treating it like a private experiment designed to calm me down. And while I waited for the second set of results, I watched my parents even more closely, noticing now with sharpened awareness how my mother flinched whenever I mentioned doctors, how she asked me pointed questions about what exactly the first test said, how she kept reminding me that family wasn't just about blood, a phrase she'd never once emphasized before, and my father grew distant in a way that felt less annoyed and more guarded, like a man bracing for impact. And I hated myself during that waiting period, because part of me hoped the second test would prove the first wrong so I could forget all of this, because even though my childhood had been painful, it was familiar pain. And the idea that there might be a deeper reason for it, a reason that rewrote my entire existence, felt too destabilizing to handle. But when the second email arrived weeks later, identical in its cold certainty, I didn't cry or scream or throw anything. I just sat very still on my couch and stared at the screen while something inside me rearranged itself permanently, because two independent tests don't make the same catastrophic error. And at that point, denial turned into investigation. Not because I wanted answers, but because my mind needed something to do with the panic, so I started digging quietly, methodically, like a detective who didn't want to know what they were going to find, pulling out old photo albums from my childhood, scrutinizing dates scribbled on the backs of pictures, noticing how there were fewer photos of my mother pregnant with me than there were with my sibling, how some timelines didn't quite line up the way I'd always assumed. And then I requested my birth records, a process that felt oddly bureaucratic for something so personal. And while waiting for those, I started asking questions that seemed casual on the surface, slipping them into conversations with relatives, asking where my parents had lived before I was born, how long they'd been married at that point, who they'd been close to back then, and some of the answers came with hesitations, pauses that stretched just a little too long, vague recollections that avoided specifics. And one aunt mentioned offhandedly that my parents had gone through a rough patch early in their marriage, something I'd never heard before, something no one had ever thought to tell me. And when I pressed gently, she waved it off, saying it was ancient history, that it didn't matter, but it mattered to me in a way I couldn't articulate yet. And when my birth records finally arrived, I sat at my dining table, flipping through papers with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, confirming dates, cross-referencing them with what I now knew, and that's when it clicked fully. Brutally, because my mother and father had been briefly separated around the time I was conceived, living apart, telling people different versions of the truth, and suddenly every strange reaction, every defensive comment, every discouraging word about digging into the past snapped into focus like a picture coming into clarity. And I felt everything at once. Fear that my life was built on a lie. Guilt for suspecting my parents of something so serious. Denial because accepting this meant rewriting my entire childhood. And a deep, aching sadness that wrapped around my chest when I realized what this could mean about why I'd been treated the way I was. And the final blow came when I used the testing platform's family matching feature, something I'd avoided because I wasn't ready, and saw my sibling listed clearly, cleanly, biologically connected to both of our parents in a way I never was. And in that moment, sitting alone, with a laptop glowing in the dim light of my apartment, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before, that the love gap I'd felt my entire life might not have been imagined, might not have been because I was too sensitive or difficult or unlovable, but because on some fundamental level, I was never truly theirs. And that realization didn't come with relief or closure, just a quiet, devastating certainty that the truth was no longer hiding. It was standing right in front of me, waiting to be acknowledged. I didn't confront my parents the way movies teach you to, with shaking hands and raised voices and dramatic ultimatums, because by the time I decided to face them, something inside me had gone eerily calm, like the quiet that settles after a storm has already destroyed everything it was going to destroy. And I drove to their house on a gray afternoon with a folder on the passenger seat containing printed DNA results, timelines I'd written out myself, and copies of birth records. Not because I thought I needed to convince them, but because I needed to protect myself from being gaslit one last time. And when I walked into the living room, the same living room where I'd spent years feeling like a guest rather than a daughter, they greeted me with forced normalcy, my mother asking if I wanted coffee, my father commenting on traffic, and my siblings sitting on the couch scrolling through their phone like this was just another family visit. And I remember thinking how surreal it felt that my entire reality was about to split open while everyone else was pretending it was just Tuesday. And I didn't waste time easing into it because I knew if I did, I might lose my nerve. So I sat down, placed the folder on the coffee table, and said calmly, I took a DNA test for medical reasons. And my mother's hand froze mid-motion, her face draining of color so fast it was almost imperceptible unless you were watching closely, which of course I was, and my father stiffened in his chair, jaw tightening, and before either of them could interrupt me the way they always used to, I continued, laying out the facts slowly, deliberately, like reading from a script I'd memorized in self-defense, telling them there was no genetic match to Dad, that I'd retested with another company, that the results were the same, that I'd looked into timelines and records, that I knew about their separation around the time I was conceived. And with every sentence, the room grew heavier until finally my mother let out a sound I'd never heard from her before, something between a sob and a gasp, and she covered her face with her hands and started crying in a way that wasn't performative or controlled, but raw and panicked. The kind of crying you do when the truth has nowhere left to hide. And my father didn't comfort her, didn't even look at her at first. He just stared straight ahead at the wall like he was bracing himself against something he'd known would come eventually. And after a long, unbearable silence, my mother admitted it, haltingly at first and then in fragments that spilled out between tears, that during that rough patch early in their marriage, she'd had an affair, that it hadn't meant anything, that she'd been lonely and scared and made a terrible mistake, that when she found out she was pregnant, she hadn't known for sure who the father was, that she'd hoped it was my dad, prayed it was my dad, and when I was born and he chose to stay, she convinced herself the truth didn't matter anymore. And listening to her talk about my existence like it was an unfortunate byproduct of her worst decision felt like being peeled open layer by layer. But I stayed quiet because I needed to hear everything, and then I turned to my father and asked him directly when he'd known, and he didn't deny it, didn't soften it. He said he'd found out early on that he'd made the choice to stay because he believed in family and stability, because he didn't want to blow up his life. And he said it with a bitterness that made it clear this wasn't a noble sacrifice so much as a resentful compromise. And in that moment, I finally understood something that had haunted me for years. Because when I asked him why he'd treated me so differently, why he'd always assumed the worst of me, why he'd never defended me the way he defended my sibling, his answer wasn't loud or angry, but devastating in its honesty. He said I was a reminder of the worst period of his life, that every time he looked at me, he saw betrayal, that my sibling, born later, unquestionably his, felt like proof that their family was real, intact, worth saving, and hearing that reframed my entire childhood in an instant. Every punishment, every accusation, every cold look suddenly snapping into place like pieces of a puzzle I'd been forced to assemble blind. And when I looked over at my sibling, expecting shock or confusion, I saw something else entirely. A tension that suggested not ignorance, but recognition. And when I asked them what they knew, they hesitated before admitting they'd known pieces of it for years. Not the full story, but enough to understand why they were treated differently. Enough to understand why rules bent for them and not for me. Enough to enjoy the safety of being the real child without ever questioning the cost. And that hurt in a way I hadn't anticipated, because it meant that some of the cruelty I'd endured hadn't just been passive favoritism, but something knowingly accepted. And through all of this, I didn't yell or cry or demand explanations, because the answers were already there, heavy and ugly and undeniable. And instead, I asked the one question that had been forming in my chest since the moment I saw the DNA results. The question that cut through every excuse and justification like a blade. I asked very quietly, why did you keep me if you never planned to love me? And the effect it had on the room was immediate and irreversible. My mother's crying stopped short like she'd been physically struck. My father finally looked at me with something like shame flickering across his face. My siblings stared at the floor and no one answered because there was no answer that didn't condemn them. And in that silence, decades of resentment, guilt, and denial collided. My mother trying to explain that she loved me in her own way. My father snapping back that love wasn't enough if it came with lies. My sibling lashing out defensively, accusing me of ruining the family by bringing this up. And I realized then that the perfect image they'd worked so hard to maintain had been built on a lie so fragile that the truth didn't just crack it, it obliterated it. And as their voices overlapped and blame ricocheted around the room, I sat there feeling strangely detached, because the pain was real, but so was the clarity. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't questioning whether my feelings were valid or whether I was imagining things. I wasn't trying to make myself smaller to keep the peace. I was simply witnessing the truth laid bare. And it hurt more than I can explain, but it also confirmed what I'd needed to know all along, that the problem had never been me. And that realization, as painful as it was, marked the end of the lie they built their love on and the beginning of something I never thought I'd have. An honest understanding of why I'd spent my entire life feeling like the child who never truly belonged. After that day, everything changed without anyone ever saying it out loud. Because once the truth exists, it seeps into every corner whether you invite it or not. And in the weeks that followed, my parents reached out more than they ever had before. Not with authority or certainty, but with a kind of nervous guilt that felt unfamiliar. My mother sending long messages trying to explain herself, revisiting her fear and loneliness back then, as if context could soften the damage, telling me she loved me and always had, even if she hadn't known how to show it. My father calling less often but speaking more carefully when he did. His words measured now, stripped of the confidence he'd worn my entire life. And I listened without interrupting, without arguing, because something in me had finally stepped out of the role of child-seeking approval. And I realized that their explanations, however sincere, weren't something I was obligated to carry anymore. So instead of engaging the way I always had, absorbing their emotions, managing their comfort, making space for their guilt, I stepped back, quietly, intentionally, choosing low contact not as punishment but as protection. Answering when I felt able, declining visits I wasn't ready for, refusing to sit in rooms where the weight of their regret threatened to collapse onto me like a debt I never agreed to owe. And the strangest part was how quickly the balance of power shifted once I stopped playing my part, because guilt replaced authority almost overnight. My mother asking instead of telling, my father hesitating where he once commanded. And I saw clearly then how much of my upbringing had been shaped by their unresolved shame. How easy it had been to place that weight on a child rather than face it themselves. And while they struggled to redefine their roles, I was doing the same work in my own life. Reaching out to friends who had shown up for me consistently, people who knew my story in pieces but had always treated me with the respect and care I'd once thought I had to earn, letting myself lean on them fully for the first time, building a version of family rooted not in obligation or blood but in choice, laughter, safety, and mutual understanding. And it felt both foreign and healing to realize that love didn't have to hurt to be real, that it didn't come with constant self-doubt or conditions. And as I grew into that truth, I watched from a distance as my parents' marriage began to fracture under the weight of secrets they buried for decades, arguments surfacing now that the unspoken was spoken, resentment my father had never processed, finally demanding acknowledgement, my mother grappling with the consequences of a choice she'd spent her life pretending was resolved. And for the first time, I understood that their dysfunction had existed long before me, that I hadn't caused it and I couldn't fix it. And my siblings struggled too in ways I hadn't anticipated, because once the truth was out, they were no longer untouchable, no longer the unquestioned center of the family narrative, forced to confront the fact that some of the privilege they'd enjoyed had been built on my exclusion. And while I didn't seek their guilt or their apology, watching them wrestle with that shift quietly affirmed something important inside me, that my pain had been real even when it was ignored. And gradually, as weeks turned into months, the constant ache I carried since childhood began to loosen its grip, replaced by a steadier sense of self that didn't rely on anyone else's validation. And the moment that sealed it for me came when I returned to my childhood home one last time, not for a confrontation or closure, but for myself, walking through rooms that once felt heavy with expectation and disappointment, touching the banister I'd gripped during countless silent walks to my room, standing in the doorway where I'd learned to make myself small. And instead of anger or grief, I felt clarity, a calm recognition that this place had shaped me but no longer defined me. And when I left, I didn't take anything with me. Not photos, not keepsakes, not symbols of a past I'd outgrown, because I didn't need proof of what I'd survived. I carried that knowledge in the way I stood straighter, breathed easier, trusted myself more, and as I drove away, I understood with quiet certainty that I wasn't the unwanted child. Not anymore, not ever in the ways that mattered. I was someone who had endured emotional abandonment, who had been denied fairness and warmth and still found a way to build a life rooted in truth. And choosing myself didn't come with fireworks or revenge or dramatic declarations, just a deep, steady peace that told me I was finally home. Not in a house or a family name, but in my own skin. The end. I grew up competing with my golden child brother. What I discovered in my mom's old letters changed everything. I don't know when I first realized I was competing with my brother, because for as long as I can remember, Ryan was already winning, and not in the loud, obvious way people imagine when they hear sibling rivalry, but in a quiet and permanent way that seeped into every corner of our house, every conversation, every look my mother gave him compared to the one she gave me. Because Ryan was the kind of kid people pointed to when they wanted an example. Straight A student, varsity athlete by sophomore year, captain of something every season, polite smile, firm handshake, the kind of boy teachers loved and neighbors bragged about even when he wasn't their kid. And then there was me, Emily, 2 years younger, standing slightly behind him in every family photo, not because anyone told me to move, but because there never seemed to be space beside him. And early on, I learned my role without anyone formally assigning it to me. I was the independent one, the kid who didn't need help, didn't need reminders, didn't need praise, because apparently needing things was a flaw in our house unless you were Ryan, in which case it was a challenge everyone rallied around. And I want to be clear that no one ever said out loud that Ryan mattered more. They didn't need to, because it was in the way my mom's voice softened when she said his name, in how she defended him before anyone accused him of anything, in how his failures were framed as pressure and my failures were framed as personal defects. And at family gatherings, it was always the same routine. Uncles clapping Ryan on the shoulder, asking about his GPA, his latest game, his college prospects, while I hovered nearby holding a plate or refilling drinks, waiting for someone to ask me something beyond how's school, which they rarely did, and if they did and I answered with anything remotely impressive, it was met with a distracted nod before the conversation drifted back to Ryan, and I learned quickly that applause in our family was a limited resource, already allocated, so I stopped reaching for it and told myself I didn't care, except I did, deeply, painfully, in ways I didn't have words for yet. And school didn't help either, because teachers love comparisons, especially when the older sibling had set the bar high. So I heard Ryan's name constantly, even when he wasn't in the room. Your brother never struggled with this. Ryan was so disciplined. I'm surprised you're Ryan's sister. And every comparison carved something small out of me. Not enough to notice all at once, but enough that by middle school, I'd started believing that excellence was expected from me and celebrated in him. And the worst part was my mother, Linda, who I love fiercely because children always love first and ask questions later, but who somehow managed to be both present and distant at the same time. Because she showed up physically, packed lunches, washed uniforms, signed permission slips, but emotionally, she rationed herself. And Ryan always seemed to get the bigger portion. Like when he forgot his homework and she stormed into the school with it, apologizing on his behalf, or when he mouthed off to a teacher and she called it stress, while I once forgot a library book and got a lecture about responsibility that lasted the entire drive home. And I remember one night, I couldn't have been more than 10, sitting at the kitchen table struggling with math, fighting tears, finally asking for help, and my mom glancing at my paper before sighing and saying, "Emily, you're smart, figure it out." Then moments later, patiently explaining a physics concept to Ryan at the counter. And that was the night something clicked for me. Not loudly, not dramatically, but like a switch flipping into place. Because I realized that in our house, love was something you earned by excelling, or something you were given by default if you were Ryan and everything else was optional. And once you understand that, as a kid, you adapt, you stop asking, you stop expecting, you start performing. So I became hyper competent. The kid who never needed reminders, the kid teachers described as quietly capable, the kid my mom bragged about in vague ways. Emily's very independent, which always felt less like praise and more like permission to ignore me, and years blurred together like that. Report cards, soccer games, science fairs, Ryan always shining brightly in the center while I orbited just outside the light. Until the moment that still sits in my chest like a stone even now, the moment I didn't know would define me until years later when I was 17 and won a statewide academic scholarship. Something big, something real, something that required essays and interviews and months of effort. And when I found out, I called my mom first, voice shaking, expecting, hoping for excitement, pride, something. And she said, "That's nice, honey," before reminding me that Ryan had a game that evening and asking if I could find my own ride to the ceremony because she and my dad couldn't make it. And I told her it was fine, because that's what I always said, and I went alone, sat in a crowded auditorium surrounded by families cheering and crying and hugging their kids. And when my name was called, I walked across the stage smiling while my hands trembled, accepting the certificate, scanning the audience even though I knew no one would be there, and I clapped for myself internally because no one else was going to. And I went home afterward and placed the certificate on the kitchen counter where it sat untouched for days until it was eventually moved aside to make room for Ryan's trophies. And that was the moment I emotionally packed my bags, even if I stayed in that house for another year, because at 18 I left for college with a sense of relief so strong it scared me. Like I'd been holding my breath my entire life and was finally allowed to exhale. And I built a life away from them, piece by piece, worked my way through school, got a solid job, an apartment I loved, friends who showed up, people who celebrated me without comparison. And over time, I convinced myself that I was over it, that childhood stuff fades, that parents do their best, that siblings grow up and move on. And when people asked about my family, I kept it neutral, kept it light, because bitterness is ugly and I didn't want to be that person. And for a while, it worked. Distance smoothing the sharp edges until my phone rang one afternoon when I was 27, and my dad's voice sounded older than I remembered. And he said my mom's health was declining. Nothing dramatic yet, just tests and appointments and uncertainty, but they needed help. And without thinking too much about it, I agreed to come home temporarily, telling myself I was an adult now, that I'd done the work, that whatever had hurt me back then couldn't reach me anymore, that I was strong enough to walk back into that house and not feel like the invisible kid trailing behind her perfect brother. And as I drove back to the place I once couldn't wait to escape, past the familiar streets and the familiar ache, I honestly believed that nothing from my past could still hurt me. And I didn't know yet how wrong I was. Coming back home as an adult felt less like returning to a childhood house and more like stepping onto a stage where the play had kept running without me. Only now, the actors looked older, tired, and slightly off script, because Ryan, the golden child, the family success story, was no longer shining the way everyone insisted he still was. And at first I noticed it in small, almost ignorable ways, like how his car was always parked in the driveway even on weekday mornings, how he slept in later than I remembered, how conversations about his big opportunities never seemed to include specifics anymore, and my parents spoke about him in vague, hopeful tones that reminded me uncomfortably of how people talk about lost potential, not active success. And slowly, the truth surfaced until I replaced in pieces. His job had fallen apart after a series of misunderstandings. His marriage had ended quietly and bitterly. No kids, no house, just boxes stacked in his old bedroom like he'd press rewind on his life. And I'd be lying if I said part of me didn't feel a grim sense of validation, not happiness, not relief, but that sharp internal whisper of, see. It wasn't just me. He wasn't untouchable after all, except that feeling curdled quickly because watching someone unravel up close is never as satisfying as you imagine from a distance, especially when that someone is your brother. The same brother who once stood effortlessly in the spotlight I kept tripping over in the dark. And yet even now, even as Ryan cracked under the weight of his own expectations, my parents, especially my mom, rushed to cushion every fall, excusing his missed deadlines as burnout, his temper as stress, his drinking as understandable, while I quietly picked up slack around the house, scheduling appointments, cooking meals, reorganizing medication lists, slipping seamlessly into the caretaker role without being asked because old habits die hard, and I'd been trained my whole life to fill gaps without acknowledgement. And the more time I spent there, the more I noticed how my mother hovered around Ryan in a way that felt almost frantic, like she was trying to hold together something already shattered, her voice sharp with me, but trembling with him, and there was tension between them that I couldn't quite name at first. Arguments that stopped abruptly when I entered the room, long silences that followed even innocent questions. And one evening, after my dad had gone to bed and my mom was asleep on the couch with the TV murmuring to itself, Ryan and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen, standing on opposite sides of the island like strangers negotiating neutral ground, and he laughed bitterly when I asked how he was really doing. The sound raw and defensive, before saying, "You wouldn't get it, you always got out," and something in me snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough that I finally said what I'd swallowed for years. That leaving didn't mean escaping, that building a life alone wasn't luck, that I'd had to fight for everything without a safety net. And he looked at me like I'd insulted him, eyes flashing, and accused me of being lucky because I didn't have the pressure of being the one everyone counted on, because I could disappear without disappointing anyone. And that argument, quiet but loaded, cracked something open between us, because for the first time I saw that his pedestal had been a cage, that being the golden child meant never being allowed to fail publicly, never being allowed to be ordinary. And that realization softened my anger even as it deepened my sadness, but it didn't erase the imbalance, didn't undo the way my mom still excused him while criticizing me for the smallest things, didn't change how she'd snap if I moved her things, but thank Ryan for breathing in the right direction. And as her health declined, missed words, misplaced objects, sudden mood swings that went from icy to explosive in seconds, I became the default organizer of chaos, the one doctor spoke to, the one pharmacies called, the one who learned how to calm her when she insisted we were lying to her. And there were moments, quiet and terrifying, when she didn't recognize me at all, but clutched Ryan's arm like a lifeline, calling him by a nickname from childhood while I stood beside them feeling like a ghost in my own family. And it was during one of those long, exhausting days of cleaning and reorganizing, sorting through decades of accumulated things because order felt like the only control I had left, that I found the box, tucked deep in the back of a hall closet behind winter coats that hadn't been worn in years. Heavier than it looked, locked with a small brass latch that immediately set off alarm bells in my head because my mother hated clutter and secrets equally. Or at least she used to. And holding that box felt like holding something that hummed with importance, something deliberately hidden. And after a moment of hesitation that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, I forced it open, heart pounding, to find old handwritten letters tied with faded ribbon, hospital documents yellowed at the edges, and envelopes addressed in my mother's handwriting to a name I didn't recognize, a name that was not my father's. And I didn't read them. Not yet. Because some instinct told me that once I did, there would be no going back. That whatever was inside explained the strange gravity in our house. The favoritism, the tension, the way love had always felt uneven and conditional. And as I closed the box with shaking hands, I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach drop, that I'd just stumbled onto the truth my family had been orbiting around my entire life, without ever saying out loud. I waited longer than I want to admit before opening the letters, because once you sense that the truth will rewrite your entire childhood, you don't rush toward it. You circle it cautiously, like an animal that knows the ground ahead might collapse. And for days that locked box sat in my room like it was breathing, like it knew I was avoiding it, until one night when the house was quiet except for my mother's uneven breathing down the hall and Ryan's footsteps pacing his old bedroom. I finally sat on the floor, pulled the box toward me, untied the faded ribbon with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and unfolded the first letter, and almost immediately I realized these weren't the kind of letters people write casually, because the handwriting was tight, emotional, pressed hard into the paper like my mother was afraid her words might escape if she didn't pin them down. And as I read, the story of my family, the version I thought I knew, began to crack open in slow, devastating pieces, because the letter spoke of a time before me, a marriage already fraying at the edges, a woman who felt trapped and invisible, a husband who had emotionally checked out long before he physically left rooms, and then a pregnancy that was not planned, not celebrated, not even fully acknowledged, just endured. And in those pages, my mother wrote about Ryan as proof of a happier version of herself. A child conceived when love still felt possible, when dreams were shared instead of deferred. And then she wrote about me, not as a baby, but as an event, a consequence, something that happened to her after betrayal, after disillusionment, after she'd already started grieving the life she thought she'd have. And it was there in ink I couldn't unread that I saw it clearly. I was not supposed to be born, not because I was unwanted in some abstract sense, but because I arrived at the worst possible moment, when my mother felt abandoned, ashamed, and exhausted, and every letter circled the same themes: loss of freedom, loss of self, the crushing weight of obligation. And somehow, heartbreakingly, my existence became the symbol she attached all of that pain to, and I sat there on the floor reading until my eyes burned, realizing that while Ryan reminded her of who she used to be, I reminded her of everything she felt she'd lost. And that realization didn't hit like anger at first. It hit like grief, because suddenly every cold look, every harsh word, every moment she'd pulled away from me instead of toward me made sense in a way I'd never allowed myself to imagine. And I cried quietly, so I wouldn't wake anyone. Cried not just for the little girl who'd tried so hard to be perfect, but for the woman my mother had been before life hardened her. And the strangest part was that the letters weren't cruel. They were honest, painfully so, full of guilt and self-awareness, my mother writing over and over that she tried to love me, that she wanted to love me, but that every time she looked at me, she felt pulled back into the worst period of her life. And I closed the last letter feeling hollowed out, like something essential had been removed from me. And the next morning, when my mother had one of her rare lucid moments, sitting at the kitchen table staring out the window like she was watching a life she no longer lived, I sat across from her and asked her quietly if she'd ever wanted me. And the silence that followed was heavier than any denial could have been, because she didn't lie, she didn't deflect, she just closed her eyes and said she had wanted to want me, that she tried, that she knew she'd failed me in ways she could never undo. And hearing that broke something open inside me, because it confirmed what the letter said without excuses or blame shifting. And I didn't scream or accuse her like people expect in stories like this. I just sat there crying while she cried too. Two women grieving different versions of the same life, and somewhere behind us, unnoticed at first, Ryan had stopped in the hallway, listening, and when he finally spoke, his voice sounded small, confused, like a child hearing the rules of the world change. And in that moment, he learned that being the golden child wasn't about being better. It was about being safe, about being the reminder of love before it broke. And I saw the weight of that realization hit him all at once. The pressure he'd carried without understanding why. The expectations he'd never been allowed to escape. And for the first time in our lives, the story between us shifted. Not into something healed or perfect, but into something honest. Something that acknowledged that neither of us had been spared. We'd just been hurt in different ways. And as I sat there surrounded by truths I never asked for, but could no longer ignore, I understood that my childhood hadn't been shaped by my failures or my brother's success, but by a wound my mother never healed. A wound she accidentally passed down to both of us. And that knowledge didn't erase the pain, but it finally gave it a shape, a beginning, a reason that wasn't my fault. After the letters were out in the open, After the truth had finally been dragged into the light where none of us could pretend it didn't exist, the house felt different. Heavier, but also strangely quieter. Like something that had been screaming beneath the walls for decades had finally gone hoarse. And I didn't wake up the next morning feeling healed or relieved or empowered the way stories like this usually end. I woke up feeling tired in a way sleep doesn't touch. Because understanding doesn't undo damage, it just explains it. And I had to sit with that truth while continuing to take care of a woman who had shaped my entire life through both what she gave and what she couldn't. And I want to be clear about something, because Reddit loves clean villains and satisfying redemption arcs, but this wasn't that. I didn't suddenly excuse my mother. I didn't rewrite my childhood as necessary or character building. And I didn't magically feel whole just because I finally knew why I'd been treated the way I was. Because knowing the reason doesn't give you back the years you spent shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's unresolved pain. And Ryan and I didn't suddenly become best friends either, but something fundamental shifted between us. Because a few nights after the confrontation, when our mom was asleep and the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, he sat across from me at the kitchen table and finally broke in. A way I'd never seen before. Not defensive or sarcastic or angry, just hollow. Admitting that he'd always felt like something was wrong, that he knew on some level he was being protected in ways that didn't make sense, that he saw how our mom treated me and didn't stop it because benefiting from favoritism is easy when you don't have to name it. And hearing him say that hurt in a way I didn't expect, because it forced me to grieve not just my relationship with my parents, but the relationship I could have had with my brother if we'd both been raised in a healthier house. And we talked that night longer than we ever had in our entire lives. Not arguing, not competing, just laying our cards on the table, acknowledging that while he had been loved loudly, it came with suffocating expectations. And while I'd been neglected quietly, it came with a kind of freedom he never had. And neither of those things cancel each other out. They just coexist, messy and unresolved. And as my mother's condition worsened, there was no dramatic final apology, no tearful deathbed confession where everything was tied up neatly, because real life doesn't do that. Sometimes people fade before they grow. Sometimes accountability arrives too late. And sometimes the most honest thing you get is silence. And when she passed, I didn't feel the release people talk about. I felt an ache layered with unfinished sentences, because there were things she never said and things I never asked, and I had to accept that closure isn't something other people give you. It's something you decide to stop chasing. And in the weeks after, as the house emptied and life began reshaping itself again, I found myself rereading the letters one last time. Not to punish myself, not to justify what happened, but to remind myself of the most important truth buried inside them. That I had never been broken, never been deficient, never been the problem trying to solve myself into lovability. I had been a child born into a wound that existed long before I could speak. And understanding that didn't make my childhood okay, but it finally released me from the belief that I had failed it. And now when I think about family, about love, about worth, I don't define them by who chose me or who didn't. I define them by the life I built anyway, by the people who show up without being asked, by the version of myself who survived being unseen and still learned how to see others. And if there's any reason I'm sharing this here, it's not for sympathy or validation. It's because for a long time I thought healing meant forgiveness, but what it actually meant for me was understanding without self-erasure, truth without excuses, and the quiet radical freedom of realizing that the letters didn't fix my childhood. They just finally proved that it was never my fault. The end. My parents blamed me for every problem. So I finally exposed the family secret they forced me to carry alone. I'm 27 now, living in the US, and I've learned that when you tell people you grew up being blamed for everything, they usually smile politely like you're exaggerating. Like every family has one kid who's dramatic. So let me be clear right up from the start. I wasn't just blamed, I was assigned the role, stamped with it early. Like a label they never planned to peel off. Because as far back as I can remember, maybe 7 or 8 years old, anything that went wrong in our house somehow traced its fingerprints back to me. And the thing is, I didn't even realize it was happening at first, because when you're that young, you assume adults tell the truth and parents are fair. So when my mom and dad fought and my name came up, I thought maybe I really had done something wrong, even when the argument had started hours before I walked into the room, because my dad would slam a cabinet and say I had talked back earlier, and that set the tone for the night, or my mom would sigh dramatically and tell him she was already stressed because I was too much lately. And just like that, their fight was no longer about money or work or whatever tension they'd been carrying for years. It was about me, the kid upstairs doing homework, and the pattern settled in so quietly that by the time I noticed it already felt normal, like gravity, like this was just how families worked. When the bills were tight, it wasn't because my parents had taken on a mortgage they couldn't afford, or because my dad changed jobs 3 times in 2 years. It was because I needed too much, because my shoes wore out fast, because I had a school trip, because I wanted books instead of toys. And those words, needed too much, stuck to me like burrs, because they weren't about any specific request. They were about my existence, about me taking up space, and I learned very early to ask for things in the smallest voice possible or not ask at all, to wear shoes with holes and pretend I liked them that way, to tell teachers I forgot lunch money even when I knew exactly where it was, because asking meant reminding my parents that I existed, and existence apparently was expensive. When my younger sibling messed up, and there was always a younger sibling in this story, shining and innocent and endlessly forgivable, it somehow came back to me too, because I was a bad influence, because they looked up to me, because I should have known better, even when I wasn't in the room, even when I was at a friend's house, even when I'd warned them not to do the exact thing they ended up doing, and my parents would shake their heads and look at me with this mixture of disappointment and exhaustion that made it feel like I was a long-term illness they were tired of managing, while my sibling cried and got hugged and told it was okay, mistakes happen, and I stood there learning, quietly, that forgiveness in our house flowed in one direction and blame flowed in the other. Extended family picked up on it fast, because families are ecosystems and narratives spread like pollen. So at holidays, I became the kid everyone watched a little too closely. The one uncles joked about like, better hide the breakables. The one aunts pulled aside and told to be good today, while my sibling was praised for breathing correctly, for smiling, for existing without friction. And no one ever asked why I was so quiet, because they'd already been told who I was. And once a story like that gets out, it doesn't need proof anymore. It just needs repetition. I learned to be careful with every word, every facial expression, because anything could be added to the case file against me, and that hyper-awareness shaped me more than any parenting book ever could, because I became the kid who anticipated reactions before they happened, who scanned rooms for emotional weather, who learned how to disappear without actually leaving, and teachers felt it too. Not because I caused problems in class, I didn't, but because my parents would come into parent-teacher conferences already defensive, already apologetic, already framing me as difficult. And when an authority figure hears that enough times, they start looking for evidence, and confirmation bias does the rest. So if I asked a question too bluntly, I was disrespectful. If I corrected a mistake, I was challenging authority. If I stayed quiet, I was withdrawn and moody, and every report card had some version of smart but attached to my name. Like, intelligence was just another flaw I hadn't learned to manage properly. Neighbors absorbed it too, the way suburban gossip works, because when a ball broke a window, it was assumed it was mine even if I wasn't home. When a complaint came in about noise, my parents would apologize on my behalf before even asking where I was, and I'd stand there feeling this strange mix of confusion and guilt, wondering if I'd somehow done something wrong without realizing it, because that's what blame does when it's constant. It teaches you to distrust your own memory, your own sense of reality. What hurts the most looking back isn't even the accusations themselves. It's how early I stopped defending myself, because I learned quickly that explanations only made things worse. That saying, I didn't do that, sounded like lying. That tears looked manipulative. So I developed this calm, flat acceptance that adults mistook for guilt. And the more I accepted blame, the more comfortable everyone became assigning it to me, because it made their lives easier. It simplified messy problems into a single, manageable source. There were moments, though, small cracks in the story that didn't make sense even to a kid, like the way my parents would panic if I asked about certain things from the past, how casual conversations would suddenly shut down if I mentioned a specific year or a specific place, how my mom's face would go pale if I laughed and said, "Remember that night when," and she'd cut me off so sharply it felt like hitting glass, or the way my dad kept one drawer in his desk locked at all times, even when the rest of the house was open and messy and unguarded, a drawer I wasn't supposed to notice, which of course meant I noticed it constantly, because kids are intuitive in ways adults underestimate, and intuition doesn't need full information to sense danger, it just needs patterns. There was also that night. There's always a night, isn't there? The one that floats in my memory without a clear beginning or end, just fragments and tension and the feeling that the air itself was wrong. A night nobody ever talks about, that gets skipped over in family stories like a missing stair. And I learned not to ask about it, because asking made my parents' voices go tight and strange, made them look at me like I'd reach for something sharp. And even at that age, I understood that whatever lived in that silence was powerful enough to rewrite the rules of our house. So I grew up carrying the weight of being the problem. Not because I believed it was true anymore, but because it was safer than challenging the story. Because as long as I accepted that role, the family stayed stable, functional on the surface, and stability is seductive when you're a kid who can feel tension like static in the walls. And by the time I was old enough to understand that this wasn't normal, that parents weren't supposed to outsource their failures to their child, the habit was ingrained so deeply that it felt like identity. Like, if I let go of the blame, I might float away entirely, untethered from the only version of family I'd ever known. And now, looking back as an adult, with distance and language and context, I can finally name what my younger self couldn't articulate, which is that They didn't just blame me because it was convenient or because they were flawed people doing their best. They blamed me because it served a purpose, because it redirected attention, because it protected something fragile and dangerous beneath the surface, because I wasn't just a problem child in their story. I was a container. And they didn't just blame me. They needed me to carry something. I've tried 100 times to write about the night everything broke. And every time I start, my brain wants to blur it out like a corrupted file. But if chapter 1 was about how blame became my identity, then this is the night it was sealed in place. The night it stopped being an accident and became a decision. Because I was 13 when it happened. Old enough to understand fear, but not old enough to understand choice. And I remember the day itself being painfully normal, which is how trauma usually sneaks in. Through routine, through the comfort of familiarity, through the lie that tonight will be like every other night. Dinner half eaten, TV murmuring in the background, my sibling in their room, my parents tense but quiet, the house holding its breath the way it always did. And then something shifted. Not loudly at first, just a raised voice, a door closing too hard, footsteps pacing back and forth, and I knew better than to insert myself. So I stayed where I was, pretending to focus on homework, while my attention stretched toward the hallway like a nerve. Because when you grow up in a house like mine, you learn to read sound the way sailors read weather, and this was a storm gathering. I won't spell out exactly what happened, not yet, because even now it feels dangerous to put it into clean sentences, but it involved one of my parents and another family member. And it crossed a line that once crossed can't be uncrossed. A line that has consequences whether you acknowledge them or not. And I remember the moment when the shouting stopped and the silence that followed felt heavier than any noise. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. And then I heard crying, real crying, the kind that doesn't care who hears it. And that's when my body moved before my brain could stop it. Because whatever I was trained to be, I was still a kid, and kids respond to pain instinctively. The next hour exists in fragments for me, voices overlapping, someone saying my name sharply, someone else saying not to call anyone, the word police floating through the air like a live wire, my heart slamming so hard I thought I might pass out, my parent pacing with the phone in their hand and then putting it down, picking it up again, the screen lighting their face in a way I'd never seen before, panicked and calculating all at once, and me standing there, useless and terrified, wishing desperately to rewind time to before dinner, before the door slammed, before everything tilted. At some point, I was told to go to my room, but I didn't. Not really. I sat on the stairs where I could hear everything, because the truth is, part of me already knew that whatever was happening was going to involve me, whether I wanted it to or not. And when the words finally came together enough for my 13-year-old brain to understand the shape of the problem, I felt something inside me collapse. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding or a bad argument or something that could be smoothed over with apologies. This was something that could destroy our family if it got out. Something that could involve courts and questions and adults in uniforms asking me what I saw, what I heard, what I knew, and the fear in my parents' voices when they realized that was possible is something I will never forget. Because it wasn't just fear of consequences. It was fear of exposure, fear of a story they couldn't control. The police almost came that night, and that's not me being dramatic. That's a fact I've replayed endlessly, because there was a moment when the decision was hanging in the air, when one of my parents was seconds away from making the call, and the other stopped them, hand closing over wrist, voice low and urgent, and in that moment, I learned something ugly about adults, which is that when survival is on the line, they don't always choose what's right. They choose what's necessary for themselves, and that's when the focus shifted, subtly but decisively, from what had happened to what could happen if anyone found out. I was pulled into a room, the door closed, the light too bright, my parent crouching in front of me like they were about to comfort me. And for half a second I thought that's what was coming, that someone would tell me it wasn't my fault, that they'd protect me. But instead, what I got was pressure wrapped in concern, fear disguised as care, words chosen carefully to steer me where they needed me to go, telling me how serious this was, how complicated, how fragile our situation was, how one wrong word could blow everything up, how people wouldn't understand, how the system would tear our family apart. And then came the sentences that changed everything, delivered not as threats, but as facts, as inevitabilities. If you say anything, this family is over. If you talk to anyone, you'll ruin everyone's life. I remember nodding, because nodding was easier than speaking, and because some part of me believed them, believed that I had the power to destroy everything just by telling the truth. And that kind of power is a terrible thing to give a child, because it doesn't feel like power, it feels like responsibility, like guilt waiting to happen. I was told what to say if anyone asked questions, how to frame the night, what details to emphasize and which ones to forget. And the scariest part is how quickly it started to feel normal, how my brain accepted the new rules without protest, because that's what kids do when they're trapped in adult problems. They adapt, they survive, they become whatever is required of them. And by the time the immediate crisis passed, by the time the house settled back into its uneasy quiet, something irreversible had happened to me, something that didn't leave a mark on my body but changed the way I moved through the world. In the days and weeks that followed, the blame didn't just return, it multiplied, intensified, sharpened into something almost ritualistic. Like punishing me, was a way to keep the secret buried, because now the narrative had an extra layer. Not only was I the difficult child, I was also the reason everyone had to be so careful, so stressed, so on edge, and every time I stepped out of line, even slightly, it was treated like proof that I couldn't be trusted, that I was a liability, that I needed to be controlled, and I internalized that so deeply that I stopped seeing myself as someone who deserved protection and started seeing myself as someone who needed to be managed. I didn't tell my friends what was happening, not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't find the words that wouldn't trigger the collapse I'd been warned about. And when adults asked vague questions, teachers noticing I was quieter, relatives sensing tension, I gave vague answers because vagueness was safer than honesty. And every time I chose silence, the lie rooted itself deeper, until it wasn't just something I was carrying, it was something I was built around. My parents acted like nothing had happened, at least publicly, and that was almost worse, because watching them laugh and make plans and pretend our family was intact while I replayed that night over and over in my head made me feel insane. Like I was living in a parallel reality no one else could see. And when I struggled, when my grades slipped or my temper flared or I withdrew even more than before, it was used as further evidence that I was the problem, that I was unstable, that I was the reason things were hard and in a twisted way that suited them, because as long as I was the focus, no one looked too closely at anything else. I learned how to carry that night quietly, how to lock it away the way my parent locked that drawer, how to flinch internally whenever the past came up in conversation, how to change the subject instinctively, how to swallow questions before they reached my mouth, and by the time I was old enough to fully understand the legal and moral implications of what had happened, I was already too deep in the role they'd given me, too invested in the idea that keeping the secret was my responsibility, my burden, my fault if it ever came out. Looking back now, with the distance of years and therapy words and adult context, I can see how calculated it all was. How the pressure was applied precisely where it would stick. How they didn't need to threaten me outright because they'd already trained me to equate my worth with the family's stability. But at 13, all I knew was that something terrible had happened, that I'd been given a choice no child should ever have to make, and that the price of keeping everyone else safe was giving up the last pieces of my childhood. Because from that night on, I wasn't just a problem child anymore. I was the keeper of a secret big enough to crush me. And that was the moment my childhood didn't fade out gradually the way it does for most people. It ended abruptly, in a house that went quiet because the truth had been locked away, with me inside it. By the time I hit high school, the lie wasn't something I remembered carrying anymore. It was something my body carried for me. Like muscle memory, like a limp you forget you have until someone asks why you walk that way. Because every day I woke up with this low-grade tension humming under my skin. The awareness that one wrong sentence, one honest reaction, one slip in tone, could crack something open that I had spent years sealing shut. And from the outside, I probably looked like a normal American teenager. Decent grades, no drugs, no real trouble. But inside, I was constantly calculating, editing myself in real time. Because I had learned the hard way that silence was safer than clarity and neutrality was safer than emotion. My parents, meanwhile, perfected their public performance. The one where they were the exhausted, long-suffering adults doing their best with a difficult son. And I watched them tell that story to teachers, guidance counselors, relatives, even friends' parents, watch them sigh and shake their heads and say things like, "We just don't know how to reach him," or "He's always been sensitive," or "There's just something going on with him." And what made it unbearable wasn't that they were lying. It was that they believed it, or at least believed it enough to make it useful, because the narrative protected them from questions, from scrutiny, from having to explain the cracks in our family that didn't line up with their wholesome exterior. I learned how to cover for them without anyone ever asking me to, how to redirect conversations when my mom's voice got too sharp or my dad's temper flared too fast, how to smooth over inconsistencies when stories didn't match, how to quietly absorb emotional fallout when one of them had a breakdown behind closed doors and then walked out smiling like nothing had happened, because if anyone noticed something was off, the explanation was already waiting. Me, the troubled son, the stressor, the common denominator. I became frighteningly good at reading microshifts in me mood, at predicting explosions before they happened, at positioning myself where I could intercept damage, and the reward for that skill was exactly nothing, because no one ever said thank you for protecting a secret they pretended didn't exist, and no one ever defended me when the narrative tightened around my throat. Dating was a disaster in slow motion, not because I didn't want connection, but because intimacy requires truth, and truth was the one thing I had trained myself to avoid. So I kept partners at arm's length without meaning to, deflecting personal questions with humor, going vague when conversations got deep, flinching when someone said, "You can tell me anything," because the last time I believed that, I was 13 and it cost me my childhood. And eventually, the people I cared about would notice the walls, would sense that I was holding something back, and they'd either push harder, triggering my panic, or give up quietly, deciding I just wasn't emotionally available, which hurt, but not as much as the idea of letting the wrong truth out. Through all of this, my parents continued to lean on me when it suited them, asking for help, emotional support, favors, reassurance, using me as a sounding board for their stress while never once stepping in to correct the picture they painted of me to the world. Never saying, actually, he's not the problem. Never pushing back when relatives joked at my expense or teachers assumed the worst. And I told myself it didn't matter, that I was independent now, that I could build a life separate from them. But the truth is, when the people who raised you refuse to defend you, it leaves a bruise that adulthood doesn't magically heal. College was supposed to be my escape, and in some ways it was. I moved away, lived in dorms, tasted freedom, but the lie moved with me, because trauma doesn't respect geography, and I found myself still censoring my past, still telling sanitized versions of my childhood that explained nothing and raised no questions, still bracing for consequences that never came but always felt imminent. And whenever I went home for breaks, I slipped right back into the old role. The same house, the same dynamics, the same unspoken rules, as if time hadn't moved at all. Then my younger sibling started struggling. Not dramatically at first, just little things. Slipping grades, mood swings, bad decisions that were brushed off initially as phases, and I felt this cold dread settle in my chest because I recognized the early signs of the cycle starting again, the subtle shift in tone, the way my parents' patience thinned, the way concern slowly curdled into frustration, and then, almost imperceptibly, the way their eyes started flicking toward me again during arguments, like muscle memory kicking in, like blame searching for its old home. It started with comments, how my sibling had always looked up to me, how my attitude might have rubbed off, how maybe if I'd been a better example, things would be different. And hearing those words after everything I had carried for years did something to me. Because this time it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the possibility that the lie I'd protected was about to claim another victim. That the same machinery that had crushed my childhood was warming up to do it again. And suddenly, the secret stopped feeling like a shield and started feeling like a loaded weapon. I watched my sibling absorb the early blame the way I once had. Watched confusion flicker across their face when they were accused of things that didn't fully make sense. And I realized with a clarity that scared me that my silence wasn't neutral, that by keeping the truth buried, I was helping maintain a system that needed a scapegoat to function. And that system was hungry again. That was the moment the weight shifted, when protecting the past stopped being about loyalty or fear and started being about complicity. And even though I didn't know yet what I was going to do or how or when, I knew something fundamental had changed inside me. Because for the first time since that night years ago, I wasn't just carrying the lie to keep my family intact. I was carrying it knowing it could destroy someone else. And that realization lodged itself in my chest like a countdown, ticking steadily. Because once you see the pattern clearly, once you recognize that history is trying to repeat itself, you can't unsee it. And the secret stops being something you endure and becomes something you have to reckon with, whether you're ready or not. The breaking point didn't come with a scream or a slammed door or some cinematic explosion the way people imagine these things do. It came on an ordinary afternoon that turned catastrophic fast. The kind of day that later feels cursed in hindsight, because it started with a call saying one of my parents had been rushed to the hospital after a sudden medical emergency. And within hours, the entire family ecosystem descended into that fluorescent lit waiting room, where old resentments and half-truths always seem to surface. Relatives whispering, phones buzzing, tension crackling under forced concern. And I showed up the way I always had, calm, composed, helpful, answering questions, filling out forms, steadying my younger sibling who was shaken and scared, and for a while it felt like muscle memory taking over, like I knew exactly where to stand and how to absorb the emotional weight without letting it show, until one of my parents, stressed, frightened, and reverting to instinct, started talking to an aunt in that familiar tone, the one laced with martyrdom, saying how hard things had been lately, how much pressure they'd been under, how my sibling was struggling, and how certain influences hadn't helped. And I felt that cold, old dread crawl up my spine. Because even here, even now, even with someone lying in a hospital bed, the narrative was reassembling itself. And then it happened, the moment that snapped something inside me, when my parent gestured toward me, not angrily, not even loudly, just casually, and said, "You know how he's always been? He creates stress wherever he goes." And a few relatives nodded automatically, because that story had been told so many times it didn't need proof anymore. And I stood there, listening to myself be blamed for a medical emergency I had nothing to do with, watching the familiar pattern unfold in real time. And for the first time, instead of shrinking, something in me went very, very still. I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself, I didn't raise my voice, I just started correcting things, gently at first, like adjusting crooked picture frames, saying things like, "That's not actually what happened," or "That timeline isn't right," or "I wasn't there when that happened." And the effect was immediate and unsettling because people aren't used to the designated problem, child calmly contradicting the official version. And I could see relatives exchanging glances, confusion flickering across faces as the stories they'd heard for years didn't line up as neatly as they thought. My parents noticed too. I could tell by the way their bodies tensed, by the sharp looks they shot me, by the subtle attempts to steer the conversation away, but I didn't stop. Not because I was trying to expose anything yet, but because I realized with startling clarity that the lie only worked if I actively participated in it. And the moment I stopped, the structure started to wobble. The conflict escalated later that evening when more family arrived and the hospital room became crowded, emotions raw, patience thin, and that's when the accusations became less subtle. My parents openly venting about how I'd always been difficult, how I made things harder during stressful times, how I was selfish for making this about me. And something about hearing that phrase, making this about me, after decades of being used as the dumping ground for everyone else's problems, finally pushed me past the point of endurance because I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. And there's a difference between those two states that's hard to explain unless you've felt it. I looked around that room at people who thought they knew my family, who thought they knew me, and I felt this strange, detached calm settle over me, the kind that comes when you've already survived the worst possible outcome in your head and realized it didn't kill you. And when my parent finished another speech about how I was the source of tension, I met their eyes and said evenly, "That's not true and you know it." And the room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than shouting ever could, because silence makes people listen. I didn't dump the truth all at once. I didn't dramatize it. I just kept correcting, filling in gaps, pointing out inconsistencies, mentioning dates that didn't match, behaviors that didn't align. And I watched the realization dawn on my relatives' faces as they started to see the cracks. Because lies told over years start to fray when examined closely. And my parents' panic was unmistakable. Their voices rising, their words tripping over each other as they tried to regain control of the story. And that's when my parents snapped, accusing me outright of trying to sabotage the family during a crisis, of being ungrateful, of always needing attention. And something in me clicked into place so cleanly it felt almost peaceful. I took a breath, not to calm down, but to steady myself. And I said the words I had never said out loud before. Not in anger, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. You want the truth? Because I've been protecting you for years. The reaction was immediate and visceral. My parents' faces draining of color, one of them stammering my name like a warning. Another stepping toward me like they could physically stop the sentence from continuing. Relatives frozen, my sibling staring at me with wide, confused eyes, and for a moment the entire weight of my childhood pressed down on me. Every warning, every manipulation, every reminder of what would happen if I spoke. And I felt it all, and then I let it go. I didn't reveal everything. Not yet, but I said enough to make it clear that the version of events everyone believed was incomplete. That I hadn't been the problem they'd been told I was, that there were reasons for my behavior that had nothing to do with being difficult and everything to do with being put in impossible positions too young. And the more calmly I spoke, the more unhinged my parents became, because panic thrives on chaos and I was refusing to give them any. The standoff that followed was one of the most emotionally brutal moments of my life. My parents pleading, deflecting, minimizing, trying to reframe my words as exaggeration or stress or mental health issues, while relatives asked careful questions and my sibling listened in stunned silence. And I realized then that the secret was already half out, that the mere act of challenging the narrative had changed something fundamental, because once people start questioning a story, it never quite regains its original power. When I finally left the hospital that night, the air outside felt different, heavier but clearer, like the pressure had dropped before a storm. And I knew with absolute certainty that there was no going back to the way things were, that the truth I'd carried for so long was no longer contained, that the family I'd spent my life protecting was standing on the edge of a reckoning. And for the first time since I was 13, I wasn't afraid of what would happen next, because whatever came, it would finally be real. After that night at the hospital, the silence didn't heal anything. It just stretched, tight and fragile, like glass about to crack. Because once you challenge a lie that's been holding a family together, everyone feels a tremor even if they pretend they don't. And over the next few weeks, the pressure built in ways both subtle and overt. Relatives calling me privately with careful voices asking what I meant, my parents oscillating between pretending nothing had happened and sending messages laced with panic and control, telling me I'd gone too far, telling me I was misremembering, telling me I was hurting people who love me. And what finally forced the truth out wasn't anger or revenge. It was exhaustion, the bone-deep kind that comes from carrying something too heavy for too long. Because one evening, sitting across from extended family at a gathering that felt more like an intervention than a reunion, with my sibling present and visibly confused and hurting, I realized that if I didn't say it now, clearly and completely, I never would, and that the cost of silence had finally become higher than the cost of honesty. So I told them what really happened that night years ago. Not in graphic detail, not for shock value, but plainly, fact by fact, explaining how a line had been crossed by a parent toward another family member, how it had escalated fast, how the situation had spiraled to the point where police involvement was a real possibility, how I had been pulled aside afterward and made to understand very clearly that the family's survival depended on my silence, that I was told in no uncertain terms that if I spoke up, if I told the truth to anyone, everything would collapse, that lives would be ruined, that it would be my fault, and how a 13-year-old, already conditioned to take blame, had internalized that responsibility like it was oxygen, believing I was protecting everyone when in reality I was being used as a shield. I explained how the narrative of me being difficult wasn't an accident or just bad parenting, but something that slowly hardened over time because it served a purpose, because it gave everyone a convenient explanation for tension, for secrecy, for emotional volatility, because as long as I was the problem, no one had to ask harder questions about anyone else. And as I spoke, I watched the reactions ripple through the room in real time, denial hitting first like a reflex, my parents interrupting, minimizing, saying I was exaggerating, misinterpreting, remembering things wrong, then breaking down when that didn't work, voices cracking, tears appearing, not just from guilt, but from the terror of exposure. And then, finally, silence, the kind that settles when there's nowhere left to hide. Some relatives looked at me like they were seeing me for the first time, connecting dots they hadn't even known were there, remembering moments that suddenly made sense, while others couldn't meet my eyes at all, because accepting the truth meant accepting their own complicity in believing the easier story for years. And my sibling, God, that was the hardest part, sat there stunned, processing not just what had happened back then, but what it meant about our entire upbringing, about the roles we'd been assigned without our consent. There was no dramatic apology, no collective realization scene, no instant absolution, just a slow, painful reckoning, relationships cracking under the weight of reality, some breaking permanently as people chose distance over discomfort, others tentatively shifting as a few family members reached out later, quietly, to say they were sorry for not seeing it sooner, for not questioning the story they'd been fed. My parents faced consequences they'd avoided for decades, not handcuffs or courtrooms, but something almost harder for them, the loss of control over how they were seen, whispers replacing unquestioned sympathy, people setting boundaries, the family mythology unraveling in public view. And watching that wasn't satisfying the way revenge stories make it seem. It was sobering and sad and strangely empty, because even when you're right, watching the people who raised you fall off the pedestal hurts in ways that don't cancel out the relief. And through all of it, something inside me slowly loosened. Not all at once, not magically, but enough that I could feel the difference, because for the first time since I was a kid, I wasn't carrying the blame for everyone else's choices. I wasn't editing my memories to protect someone who never protected me, and even though the aftermath was messy and unresolved and deeply imperfect, the weight I'd lived under for most of my life was finally off my shoulders. I didn't get closure in the neat, cinematic sense, and I'm still working through the damage in therapy and in quiet moments when old instant things flare up, but I got something better than apologies or reconciliation. I got my own truth back, spoken and witnessed and no longer buried, and in the end I chose peace over proximity, distance over duty, understanding that family isn't defined by how much pain you're willing to absorb in silence, and that walking away doesn't mean you lost. Sometimes it means you finally stopped losing yourself. The end.